Imagine waking in the dead of night to a sound so unnatural, so deeply wrong, that your blood turns cold before your mind even understands why. That's the Banshee's gift to Ireland, a sound that stopped hearts and froze entire villages in terror. This isn't just spooky folklore. Understanding the Banshee cry means understanding how sound shapes fear, how communities process death, and why certain cultural memories never fade. Let's pull back the veil on Ireland's most haunting voice. The Banshee is fundamentally a herald, an announcer of death. She doesn't cause it. She simply knows it's coming and feels compelled to warn the living through her voice. Think of her as Ireland's supernatural town crier. But instead of good news, she brings the darkest possible announcement. Her cry is her signature, her calling card, and for centuries it was the sound Irish families dreaded most. So where does this start? Let's break down the Banshee phenomenon into three clear elements: the sound itself, the hearing versus seeing distinction, and the emotional aftermath that rippled through communities. First, the sound. Describing a Banshee cry is like trying to describe a color that doesn't exist. Witnesses across centuries struggled with it. Some said it resembled a fox's scream, that high-pitched shriek that cuts through silence like a blade. Others compared it to wind howling through a narrow gap, but with an unmistakably human quality threading through. Still others described it as similar to a cat in agony, yet somehow wrong, somehow more. The Irish Folklore Commission, which systematically collected testimonies in the 20th century, found remarkable consistency in these descriptions despite people living in different counties and different eras. The cry was always described as carrying multiple qualities at once: animal yet human, mournful yet angry, near yet distant. It defied easy categorization, which made it all the more disturbing. One account from County Cork describes a family in the 1800s waking to hear what they first thought was a woman in distress outside their cottage. The father rushed to the door with a lantern, ready to help. But when he opened it, the sound seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere. It circled the house, rising and falling, never quite locating itself in space. He stood in the doorway, lantern shaking in his hand, while his family huddled inside. The cry went on for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. By morning, word came that his brother, travelling in a neighbouring county, had died in the night. Here's what made the Banshee cry especially powerful. It was always heard before it was seen. This matters more than you might think. Sound penetrates walls. It reaches you in bed, in your most vulnerable state. It doesn't require you to look out the window or step outside. The Banshee could reach into your home, into your sleep, and drag you into waking terror without your consent. Sight requires action, requires witness. Sound just happens to you. The distinction between hearing and seeing shaped how the Banshee legend evolved. While some accounts do describe visual encounters, these are far rarer. The cry came first, always. In many recorded cases, families never saw anything at all. They simply woke to that sound, recognized it for what it was, and waited in dread for the news they knew would follow. The absence of a visual form made the experience somehow worse. Your imagination filled in the gaps, creating whatever horror your mind conjured as the source of such a sound. Every person who heard it essentially experienced their own personal version of the Banshee, shaped by their fears. This brings us to our second element. Why sound-dominated sight in Banshee encounters? Part of this relates to practical realities of rural Irish life. Cottages were small, windows were few, and at night, darkness was absolute. No street lights, no neighbouring glow. When you heard something outside, you couldn't just glance out and identify it. You were trapped inside with only sound to guide you. The Banshee exploited this vulnerability perfectly. She operated in the realm where human senses were weakest and imagination strongest. But there's a deeper reason too. In Irish tradition, the supernatural world and the human world were separated by thin barriers, especially at certain times and places. Night was one of those times. Darkness weakened the boundary between the living and the dead, between the mortal realm and the realm of spirits. Sound could cross that boundary more easily than form. A cry could slip through from one world to another without fully manifesting. This meant the Banshee could perform her function, delivering her warning, without fully entering the human world. She remained partially in her own realm, announcing from the threshold. Now let's consider the third element. What happened after people heard the cry? The emotional impact on communities was profound and long-lasting. In small Irish villages where everyone knew everyone, a Banshee cry wasn't a personal experience. It was a communal event. One family might hear it directly, but by morning the entire village knew. Word spread faster than wildfire, and then came the waiting, because the Banshee announced death, but she rarely specified when. Sometimes the death occurred that same night. Sometimes it took days or even weeks. The family attached to the cry lived under a shadow, and everyone around them shared in the dread. Sleep became difficult after a Banshee encounter. Accounts consistently mention sleeplessness, families staying awake through the night with candles lit, afraid of what the darkness might bring next. Children were kept inside. Normal routines fell apart. Work went undone. The psychological weight of knowing death was coming, of waiting for the inevitable, created a kind of suspended horror. It wasn't just a moment of hearing the cry. It was the hours and days afterward, living with that knowledge, watching family members with new anxiety, wondering who would be taken. Consider this ripple effect. When one family experienced a Banshee warning, it affected everyone. Neighbors brought food and comfort. They sat with the family during dark hours. They spoke in hushed tones about which family member might be at risk. Was it the elderly grandmother, the brother who had been coughing, the son travelling abroad, the community mobilized around anticipated grief? This collective response reinforced the Banshee's power. She didn't just frighten individuals. She activated entire social networks around the expectation of death. Here's a detail that often gets overlooked. Not every strange sound in the night was dismissed as mere animal or wind. In rural Ireland, people were deeply attuned to natural sounds. They knew what foxes sounded like, what wind did, what cats in heat wailed. When they said a sound was different, they meant it. Their lives depended on understanding their environment. Farmers could identify problems with livestock from sound alone. Women could tell what kind of storm approached by how wind moved through trees. These were not naive people jumping at shadows. When they said a cry was supernatural, they were making an informed judgment based on lifelong experience with their acoustic environment. The Banshee cry also created a kind of cultural litmus test. Hearing it marked you as connected to old Ireland, to the authentic traditions that predated modern skepticism. Families who experienced banshee encounters gained a certain status, a validation that their lineage mattered enough for the supernatural world to notice. This wasn't always welcome, of course, but it did reinforce family identity and connection to the past. You weren't just descended from Irish people. You were descended from the kind of Irish people the banshee attended to. Let's talk about the physical descriptions of the sound in more detail. The pitch was consistently described as high and keening. Keening is a specific kind of wailing associated with Irish funeral traditions, which we'll explore more later. It involves a rising and falling vocal pattern that expresses deep grief. The banshee's cry followed this pattern, but amplified it beyond human capability. One witness described it as starting low, building to an impossible high note, holding there until you thought your ears would burst, then falling again. Another said it came in waves, 3 distinct cries, each more mournful than the last. The number 3 appears frequently in Celtic tradition as spiritually significant, marking this as supernatural rather than natural. The cry also reportedly carried emotional weight beyond just sound. People described feeling grief wash over them when they heard it, even before they understood what it meant. It wasn't just frightening. It was deeply sad, filled with mourning. This emotional resonance is what separated it from ordinary scary sounds. A fox scream is startling. A banshee cry broke your heart while it terrified you. It forced you to feel the loss before the loss even occurred. This preemptive grief is psychologically devastating in ways simple fear isn't. Children who heard the banshee carried the memory for life. Adults would describe encounters from their childhood in vivid detail decades later, their voices still shaking with the remembered fear. The sound imprinted itself on memory in ways few other experiences did. This generational transmission of direct testimony kept the legend alive and consistent. It wasn't just a story passed down. It was an experience passed down, recreated in the telling, until listeners felt they had heard it too. Nighttime routines changed in households that had experienced banshee warnings. Windows were shuttered more firmly. Prayers were said with extra fervor. Some families placed protective items near doors and windows, iron nails or blessed objects, anything that might keep the fairy realm at bay. Others accepted that if the banshee called, no protection would help. The death was fated. All you could do was prepare your soul and comfort your family. The banshee cry became such a powerful cultural symbol that it was invoked even in situations where no actual cry occurred. If someone died unexpectedly, people would sometimes claim retrospectively that they'd heard something strange the night before. Memory is malleable, especially around traumatic events. The expectation of a banshee warning was so strong that people supplied the memory even when it hadn't happened. This shows how deeply embedded the belief became. The banshee didn't just warn of death. She defined how Irish communities processed death itself. Here's something fascinating. The cry was never described as calling a name or saying words. It was pure sound, pure emotion expressed vocally. This lack of language made it universal. It didn't matter if you spoke Irish or English or couldn't speak at all. The cry communicated on a deeper level, bypassing language entirely to hit something primal in the human nervous system. You didn't need to understand it intellectually. Your body understood it instantly. This is the mark of truly effective folklore. It works on instinct before reason. Weather could amplify the effect. On stormy nights when wind was already unsettling, a banshee cry wove through the natural chaos and made it supernatural. On calm, clear nights, the cry stood out in stark relief against silence, impossible to miss or explain away. Either way, the timing always felt intentional. She chose her moments for maximum impact. This wasn't random haunting. It was purposeful announcement. The aftermath in villages showed how deeply people believed. When news came that someone had indeed died, especially someone connected to a family that had heard the cry, it confirmed the banshee's power. But here's what skeptics often miss. Confirmation bias works both ways. Cases where no death followed a strange sound were forgotten or explained away. Cases where death occurred without any cry were marked as exceptions, not contradictions. The human mind naturally selects evidence that supports existing beliefs. The banshee legend survived because it was constructed in a way that made it almost impossible to disprove. Any ambiguous sound could be reinterpreted as her warning. Any death could be traced back to some sound someone might have heard. Yet dismissing the phenomenon as mere superstition misses the point. The banshee served real psychological and social functions. She gave communities a framework for processing sudden death. She provided warning that allowed families to gather, to say goodbyes, to prepare spiritually and practically. In an era of high mortality and limited medical understanding, death came suddenly and without explanation. The banshee gave it meaning and pattern. She suggested that death wasn't random chaos, but something monitored by the supernatural world. This was oddly comforting, even as it was frightening. Someone was paying attention. Your death mattered enough to be announced. The cry also validated grief. In cultures where stoicism was often valued, especially for men, the banshee modeled open mourning. Her wailing gave permission for others to wail. She demonstrated that death deserved loud, emotional response. This cultural permission around grief expression had genuine mental health benefits. People who could mourn openly processed loss more healthily than those forced to suppress it. The banshee, in her terrifying way, was actually facilitating healthier grief practices. Let's wrap this up by recognizing what we've learned. The banshee cry wasn't just a spooky sound. It was a multifaceted cultural phenomenon that served psychological, social, and spiritual functions in Irish communities. It operated primarily through sound because sound was the most effective medium for the message and the moment. And it left emotional impacts that lasted generations, shaping how entire communities understood death, fate, and the supernatural world's relationship to human life. The cry froze Ireland not just with fear, but with a kind of awe at the persistence of mystery in an increasingly explained world. But where did this terrifying voice come from? To understand that, we need to go back much further, into ancient Ireland and the mysterious world beneath the fairy mounds. Understanding the banshee's origin changes how you see Ireland itself. This isn't just about a ghost story. It's about how landscape, belief, and cultural memory intertwine to create meaning that lasts thousands of years. By exploring where the banshee came from, you'll understand how ancient peoples made sense of death and why certain places still feel charged with otherworldly presence. Let's dig into the deep past and uncover her oldest roots. The name itself, is the key to everything. Banshee, pronounced roughly Banshee, translates directly to woman of the fairy mound. Break that down further. Bean means woman. Seed refers to the fairy mounds that dot the Irish landscape. But seed means more than just a mound of earth. It refers to the supernatural beings who inhabit those mounds and to the mounds themselves as gateways between worlds. So the Banshee is fundamentally a threshold creature, a woman of the in-between places where mortal reality and fairy reality overlap. What were these fairy mounds? This is where Ireland's ancient landscape and belief system merge. Across Ireland, you'll find thousands of earthen mounds, many dating back to the Neolithic period, 4,000 to 5,000 years ago. Some are burial sites containing chambered tombs where Stone Age people interred their dead. Others are standing structures from the Bronze and Iron Ages. To ancient and medieval Irish people, these weren't just archaeological features. They were powerful, dangerous places where the boundary between worlds grew thin. Let's break the Banshee's ancient context into three clear buckets: the physical reality of burial mounds, the spiritual cosmology that gave them meaning, and how Christianity transformed both. First, the burial mounds themselves. Imagine the Irish countryside in ancient times. Rolling green hills, scattered settlements, and rising from the landscape at intervals, these mysterious earthen structures. Nobody alive remembered building them. They predated memory, predated written history. They simply were, ancient as the land itself. To a farmer tilling fields nearby, these mounds represented something beyond human understanding. The people who built them were gone, but the structures remained, permanent and inscrutable. Archaeological evidence shows these mounds were indeed burial sites, but this doesn't diminish their spiritual significance. In Celtic worldview, death wasn't an ending, but a transformation. The dead didn't disappear. They continued existing in another realm, one that shared geography with the living world, but existed in a different dimension. The burial mounds were seen as entry points to this other realm. Bury someone in a mound, and you place them at the threshold between worlds, at the doorway to the land of the dead. Here's what made this particularly powerful. These mounds were often situated on elevated ground, at crossroads, or near water sources. These locations were already considered liminal, in-between spaces in Celtic thought. Elevation brought you closer to sky gods. Crossroads were places where multiple paths converged, creating spiritual confusion where normal rules didn't apply. Water was universally seen as a boundary between realms. Placing mounds at these already significant locations doubled their power. They became the most spiritually charged places in the landscape. People didn't casually approach these mounds. Stories warned that disturbing them brought disaster. Ploughing too close, taking stones from them, or entering their chambers without proper protection could anger the beings inside. And what beings were inside? This brings us to our second bucket: Irish cosmology and the nature of the Saige. In pre-Christian Irish belief, the world had multiple layers of reality existing simultaneously. The mortal world was the surface layer, where humans lived and died. Beneath or alongside it existed the other world, called Tir na Nog among other names, land of the young, land of eternal life. This wasn't heaven or hell. It was a parallel realm with its own geography and inhabitants. The seed, often called fairies in English, but that word doesn't capture their nature, were the primary inhabitants of this other world. The sea were not cute little creatures with wings. They were powerful, dangerous beings of ambiguous morality. Some accounts describe them as fallen angels, too good for hell, but not good enough for heaven. Other traditions say they were the Tuatha De Danann, the ancient gods of Ireland, who retreated into the mounds when humans took over the land. Either way, they possess power beyond human capability and motivations humans couldn't fully understand. They could help or harm humans, often on apparent whim. They demanded respect and offering. They punished transgression severely. Women held special status among the Sige. Female fairy beings were particularly powerful and particularly interested in human affairs. They could bless crops, cure illness, or bring prosperity. They could also blight, curse, and destroy. This ambivalence around female supernatural power is important for understanding the Banshee. She inherits this tradition of powerful, unpredictable female spirits whose favor you courted and whose anger you feared. The cosmology included specific beliefs about death and fertility. Here's where it gets interesting. Female Siddhi spirits were associated with both life and death, with birth and burial. This wasn't contradictory in Celtic thought. Life and death were parts of the same cycle, two faces of the same force. A spirit who brought life also necessarily dealt with death. The Banshee emerges from this tradition. She isn't purely a death spirit. She's a spirit concerned with the entire life-death cycle of certain families. Ancient Irish sources describe female spirits who attach themselves to particular lineages. These weren't guardian angels. They were more like supernatural overseers with vested interest in the family line continuing. They celebrated births and mourned deaths with intensity. They wanted the family to thrive because their own identity was tied to that family's. Continuation. When a family member died, especially someone important to the lineage, the spirit mourned genuinely. Her wailing wasn't malicious. It was authentic grief from a being whose existence was woven into that family's fate. This brings us to our third bucket. What happened when Christianity arrived in Ireland? Christianity didn't simply erase pagan beliefs. Instead, there was centuries of negotiation and blending. The Church couldn't eliminate deeply held beliefs about the Sige and the other world. Too many people had direct experiences or believed they did. Instead, Christian teaching reframed these beliefs, trying to make them fit within Christian cosmology. The fairy mounds were increasingly described as dangerous, spiritually suspect places. The beings inside weren't neutral nature spirits, but potential demons or souls in purgatory. The Church discouraged engagement with them. Offerings to the seed here became forbidden practices associated with devil worship. Yet people continued traditional practices anyway, just more quietly. The mounds retained their power in popular imagination, even as official religion condemned them. For the Banshee specifically, this transition was complicated. Her role as death announcer could be interpreted as useful. If God allowed certain spirits to warn families of coming death, that could be seen as merciful, giving time for final rites and confession. Some clergy accepted the Banshee as a neutral or even positive phenomenon, part of God's mysterious ways. Others condemned her as demonic deception trying to disturb the faithful. This theological ambiguity meant the Banshee survived Christianization better than many pagan figures. She became a grey area, neither fully accepted nor fully rejected. The shift from pagan to Christian Ireland changed the banshee's character in subtle ways. In older traditions, she was amoral, neither good nor evil, simply performing her function. Post-Christianity, she took on darker tones. Her appearance became more frightening, more explicitly connected to sin and judgment. Stories began emphasizing the terror she caused, rather than the service she provided. She became less an ancient nature spirit and more a harbinger of damnation. Consider this ripple effect. As Christianity redefined the other world as hell or purgatory, the fairy mounds became entrances to potentially damned realms. The banshee, emerging from those mounds, became tainted by association. Yet she couldn't be completely demonized because too many respectable families claimed her attention. If the banshee only warned noble, ancient families, she couldn't be purely evil, or that would imply those families were cursed. This tension preserved her ambiguous status. The physical landscape reinforced these beliefs constantly. You couldn't escape the mounds. They were everywhere, permanent features of daily life. Every time you saw one, you remembered the stories, the warnings, the possibility that otherworld beings lived just beneath your feet. This constant reminder kept beliefs alive across generations. The land itself was a textbook teaching ancient religion more effectively than any written doctrine. Seasonal festivals strengthened the connection between mounds and the other world. Samhain, celebrated at the end of October, was believed to be when the boundary between worlds was thinnest. The seed could move more freely into the mortal realm. Humans could more easily stumble into fairy territory. The banshee was most active during these liminal times. Her cry was heard more frequently around Samhain and other festival periods. This pattern reinforced the belief that she came from the other world, following otherworld rules and rhythms. Here's a fascinating detail about how these beliefs operated. People developed complex rules for interacting with cedar-haunted places. Never walk clockwise around a fairy mound, always counterclockwise. Never take anything from a mound, not even a stone. If you must pass a mound at night, ask permission aloud and leave a small offering. These rules serve psychological functions, giving people sense of control over uncontrollable supernatural forces. Follow the rules and you'd be safe. Break them, and any misfortune could be attributed to your transgression. The banshee fit into this rule structure. She couldn't be controlled or summoned, but there were right and wrong ways to respond when she appeared. You didn't mock her or tell her to be quiet. You didn't run outside to confront her. You stayed inside, said prayers, and accepted her message. This passive acceptance was the safest response when dealing with cedar beings. Don't challenge, don't provoke. Simply acknowledge their power and wait for them to leave. Women held special knowledge about these traditions. Older women especially were repositories of lore about the fairy realm, about protective practices, about interpreting signs. The banshee, being female, meant that women felt a particular connection to understanding her. Mothers taught daughters about the banshee in ways fathers teaching sons might not emphasize. This created gendered transmission of supernatural knowledge, with women as the primary experts on death omens and spirit behavior. The association between femininity and death wasn't unique to Ireland, but Irish culture developed it in specific ways. Female spirits controlled fertility, childbirth, death, and mourning. These were the transitions that mattered most: birth and death, entry and exit from mortal life. Having female spirits oversee these transitions made intuitive sense in the cultural logic. Women experienced childbirth directly, understood its dangers, lived intimately with the possibility of death in every pregnancy. Female spirits who guided souls through death paralleled midwives who guided babies into life. Let's consider how this ancient foundation shaped everything that came after. The Banshee wasn't invented in the Middle Ages or the 17th century. Her roots reached back thousands of years into Neolithic Ireland. Every element of her legend, her connection to mounds, her wailing, her focus on certain families, her liminal nature, came from these ancient beliefs about land, spirits, and the relationship between living and dead. Christianity added new layers, but didn't erase the foundation. The Banshee endured because she was built on bedrock, on beliefs so old and deep that they felt like truth rather than stories. Here's the landing. The Banshee emerged from a world view where landscape was alive with spiritual significance, where the dead remained active presences, and where certain places served as doorways between realms. She represented ancient feminine power over life and death, surviving both the coming of Christianity and the passage of millennia. Her cry echoed from fairy mounds built by forgotten peoples, carrying meanings that predated language itself. She was, and in some sense still is, Ireland's oldest voice, speaking from a time when burial mounds were new and the boundary between worlds was acknowledged by everyone. But the Banshee didn't haunt just anyone. Her attention was selective, reserved for certain families whose bloodlines she followed across generations. Why did she choose them? The Banshee's selectivity reveals something profound about identity, status, and how families understood their place in Irish society. This isn't about random haunting. It's about belonging, ancestry, and the weight of history carried in your surname. Understanding why the Banshee attached to specific families shows you how communities created and maintained social hierarchies through supernatural belief. Let's explore who the Banshee chose and what that choice meant. The fundamental rule was simple. The Banshee followed only the oldest Irish families, those who could trace their lineage back to ancient Gaelic nobility. This wasn't folklore for everyone. It was exclusive, restricted to families with names like O'Neill, O'Brien, O'Connor, O'Grady, Kavanagh, and a handful of others. These names represented real political power in medieval Ireland. They were the families who once ruled territories, commanded armies, and shaped Irish history. The Banshee recognized and honored that power even after political realities changed. Let's organize this into 3 clear sections. The concept of Milesian descent, how family traditions maintain Banshee connections, and what this selectivity meant for social identity. First, what was Milesian descent? This relates to Irish origin mythology. According to medieval Irish tradition, the Milesians were the final wave of invaders who conquered Ireland, defeating the Tuatha De Danann, those ancient gods who became the Cedar and retreated into the fairy mounds. The Milesians became the ancestors of the Gaelic Irish nobility. Claiming Milesian descent meant claiming direct bloodline connection to Ireland's legendary conquerors. It legitimized your family's right to rule. Now, this mythology was created in the Middle Ages to give Irish nobility ancient pedigree. Whether anyone was literally descended from mythical Milesians is historically irrelevant. What mattered was the claim itself. Families who successfully asserted Milesian descent gained status and authority. And here's where the Banshee becomes crucial. Having a Banshee meant your family was old enough, important enough, that the supernatural world recognized your claim. She was validation written in wailing. The major families who claimed Banshees were concentrated in specific regions. The O'Neills dominated Ulster, the northern province. The O'Briens held sway in Thomond, part of Munster in the southwest. The O'Connors controlled Connaught in the west. These weren't minor local chiefs. These were the families who crowned high kings, who fought Viking invasions, who resisted Norman conquest. Their political power was real and extensive for centuries. The Banshee's attachment to them reflected that real power. Here's the interesting part. As these families branched and spread, the Banshee supposedly followed all legitimate branches. If an O'Neill moved to a different county, the Banshee still tracked that family line. If an O'Brien daughter married and their children carried a different surname, there was theological debate about whether the Banshee followed the mother's blood or the father's name. Generally, the Banshee was understood to follow the original family name, the patrilineal descent. This mirrored how property and titles were inherited. The Banshee, in effect, enforced traditional inheritance patterns through supernatural means. This brings us to our second section, how families maintained and passed down their connection to the Banshee. This wasn't passive folklore. It required active cultivation across generations. Families had to remember and retell their Banshee stories, had to maintain the belief that they were important enough for supernatural attention. This storytelling served crucial functions within the family structure. Grandparents told grandchildren about the night the Banshee cried for great-grandfather. They described the sound in detail, the date, the circumstances. They connected that cry to the old man's death 3 days later. They impressed upon the children that this was real, that it proved the family's ancient status. This wasn't just entertainment. It was education in family identity. You learned who you were through these stories. You learned that your surname carried weight, that your ancestors mattered, that you were part of something larger than yourself. Each family developed its own body of Banshee lore. The O'Neills told different stories than the O'Briens, though the essential pattern remained the same. A death, a cry, a validation that even the other world noticed when this family lost a member. Over time, certain details became fixed. The O'Neill Banshee appeared a particular way. The O'Brien Banshee had specific habits. These variations distinguished families from each other while maintaining the overarching belief that Banshees were real and selective. Noble deaths received special attention. When a chief died, when a head of household passed, when someone important to the family line was lost, the Banshee's cry was expected. If no one heard it, that was noteworthy, sometimes interpreted as a bad sign. Had the family fallen so far that even the Banshee abandoned them? Conversely, hearing the cry reaffirmed that despite changing political fortunes, despite lost lands or diminished power, the family still mattered in the cosmic sense. The supernatural realm still kept track. Repeated appearances across generations built a narrative of continuity. Your great-great-grandmother heard the Banshee in 1743. Your grandmother heard her in 1862. You heard her in 1930. This repetition across time proved the family's enduring importance. It suggested that something essential about the family persisted despite all surface changes. Names might change, fortunes might rise and fall, but the core identity that attracted the Banshee's attention remained constant. There's a kind of prestige embedded in this system. Not every family could claim a Banshee. If someone from a newer family, or from English or Scottish settler stock, claimed to have heard a Banshee, old Irish families were skeptical. The Banshee doesn't follow just anyone, they'd say. She knows her own. This created a supernatural gatekeeping mechanism. You couldn't fake your way into ancient Irish nobility. The Banshee herself supposedly knew the truth of your lineage. Her presence or absence was a referendum on your claims to authenticity. Consider this ripple effect. When a family's fortunes declined, when they lost land or political power, the Banshee connection remained as consolation. You might be poor now, but you were descended from greatness, and the Banshee proved it. She became a kind of supernatural aristocracy that couldn't be revoked by human authorities. English conquest might strip your lands and titles, but it couldn't silence the Banshee. She answered to older laws, older hierarchies that predated and superseded colonial power structures. This brings us to our third section, what the Banshee's selectivity meant for social identity and community structure in Ireland. The Banshee helped maintain clear social boundaries at a time when those boundaries were increasingly under pressure. Norman invasion in the 12th century, English colonization intensifying from the 16th century onward. These forces threatened traditional Irish social structures. Having a Banshee was a way of asserting that you were truly Irish, not just by residence, but by blood and by supernatural recognition. Families without Banshees were implicitly lesser in this system. This doesn't mean they were disrespected in daily life, but there was a subtle hierarchy of antiquity. Old Gaelic families with Banshees stood at the top. Families of more recent origin, or families whose ancestry was mixed, stood lower. This hierarchy was reinforced every time someone told a Banshee story, every time the selectivity was mentioned. It was a constant, low-level assertion of who belonged most fully to Ireland. For families with Banshees, there was psychological complexity around her appearances. Pride mixed with dread. Yes, the cry meant someone would die, which was terrible. But it also meant your family still mattered enough for the supernatural world to notice. It meant you weren't just any death. You were a death worth announcing. This transformed grief into something else, something that included validation and even a strange comfort. You weren't alone in your loss. The other world mourned with you. The Banshee's attention also imposed responsibility. If the supernatural world cared about your family, you had to maintain standards worthy of that attention. You couldn't let the family name fall into disrepute. You had to marry appropriately, maintain traditions, raise children who understood their heritage. The Banshee became an invisible enforcer of family honor. Who wants to be the generation that loses the Banshee's attention through unworthiness? Intermarriage complicated these beliefs. When a daughter from a Banshee family married into a non-Banshee family, what happened? Most traditions held that the Banshee stayed with her birth family, tracking her father's lineage rather than following her to her husband's family. But if her sons later had families, might the banshee follow that diluted bloodline? These were genuine questions debated in communities. Their answers reflected broader anxieties about maintaining pure Gaelic identity in an increasingly mixed society. Here's something that often gets overlooked. Claiming a banshee could be contentious. If your family said the banshee followed them, you are making a claim about your ancestry that others might dispute. Do you really descend from the ancient O'Neills? Or are you a cadet branch that split off centuries ago? Are you legitimate nobility or pretenders? The banshee became evidence in genealogical arguments. If multiple people heard her cry before your grandfather's death, that supported your claim. If no one ever heard her despite your assertions of noble descent, that was suspicious. The Irish practice of sept names complicated things further. A sept was a subdivision of a larger clan, all theoretically descended from a common ancestor. The O'Neill name, for example, included multiple septs with different territorial holdings and slightly different genealogies. Did each sept have its own banshee, or did they share one? Did she distinguish between legitimate and illegitimate branches? These questions mattered for understanding your place in the social hierarchy. They also gave people something to argue about at length, which humans universally enjoy. Immigrant families carried these beliefs abroad. When O'Briens moved to America, they brought stories of their family banshee. This created continuity with the homeland. It reminded children of their Irish roots. It maintained a sense of being special, of belonging to something ancient and powerful. The banshee became a portable marker of identity that survived the Atlantic crossing. She wasn't limited to Irish soil. She followed the blood wherever it went. Let's also acknowledge the class dimensions. While the banshee supposedly followed only ancient noble families, over time the definition of who counted as suitably ancient expanded somewhat. Families who weren't technically high nobility, but who had been established in Ireland for many generations, began claiming banshees. The boundaries got fuzzy. This made sense as political structures changed and old noble families lost their formal power. If nobility no longer meant much in legal or political terms, its supernatural manifestations became even more important for maintaining distinctions. The banshee stories also reinforced ideas about fate and destiny that were central to Irish cultural identity. If your family had a banshee, you are part of an unbreakable chain connecting past, present, and future. Your individual life mattered less than the continuation of the bloodline. This sounds harsh to modern ears, but it provided genuine psychological comfort in an era of high mortality and limited individual agency. You weren't just yourself. You were a link in an eternal chain that the supernatural world itself acknowledged and protected. Women in these families had complex relationships with the banshee. On one hand, she represented powerful femininity, a female spirit whose authority men couldn't challenge. This gave women a certain reflected importance. Your family's banshee was often called our banshee by the women of the household, creating a sense of feminine lineage parallel to male political lineage. Grandmothers passed banshee knowledge to granddaughters with particular emphasis, creating women's knowledge that men might hear but didn't fully own. On the other hand, the banshee could be oppressive. Her cry meant losing someone you loved. It meant grief was coming and you couldn't prevent it. Women, as primary caregivers and emotional labourers in families, bore the brunt of responding to banshee warnings. They nursed the sick, prepared bodies for burial, organised funerals, maintained mourning practices. The banshee announced work that would fall primarily on women's shoulders. So while she represented female power, she also symbolized female burden. Children raised in banshee families learned early that they were different. When playing with children from non-banshee families, they might mention casually that their family had a banshee, watching for impressed reactions. It was a form of childhood social currency. It made you interesting. It gave you scary stories that other kids didn't have. It also taught you that your family identity was bound up with supernatural forces, that you came from something larger and older than the present moment. The selectivity also created a peculiar dynamic where families almost competed over whose banshee was most powerful or most active. My family's banshee cries louder than yours. Our banshee appears as a beautiful maiden. Yours is an old hag. These comparisons were petty in one sense but important in another. They were negotiations over relative status within the small circle of families who could claim banshees at all. Everyone else was excluded from the conversation entirely. Consider how this system handled doubt and skepticism. Even within believing families, individuals might privately question whether the sounds they heard were really supernatural. But expressing that doubt was difficult. It meant questioning your family's identity and status. It meant suggesting your ancestors were liars or fools. It meant potentially diminishing your family's standing in the community. So doubt was suppressed or reframed. Maybe I didn't hear her that time, but grandmother certainly did 30 years ago. Maybe this cry was just a fox, but the one before father's death was definitely her. Belief was maintained through social pressure as much as personal conviction. The theological status of the banshee created interesting negotiations with the Catholic Church, which dominated Irish life after the Reformation. Priests had to navigate carefully. They couldn't fully endorse belief in banshees without seeming to support pagan superstition, but they couldn't condemn it too harshly without alienating important families in their parishes. The solution was often strategic ambiguity. The Church acknowledged that strange things happened, that God's creation contained mysteries, that the dying sometimes received warnings through means we don't fully understand. This let banshee beliefs continue without official church approval. Some priests were more tolerant than others. An older priest who'd grown up in a banshee family might treat the belief sympathetically, even incorporate them into his understanding of God's providence. A younger, seminary-educated priest might push back harder against what he saw as pagan remnants. Families learned which priest to confide in about supernatural experiences and which to avoid. This created variation in how openly banshee beliefs were discussed depending on who held religious authority in a given place and time. The banshee's connection to specific families also meant she became entangled in family feuds and politics. If two branches of a family were disputing who held legitimate claim to leadership, a banshee appearance for one branch but not the other could be interpreted as supernatural judgment. The otherworld recognized this branch as the true line. This made banshee sightings potentially explosive in families with internal conflicts. People might lie about hearing her to bolster their claims. Others might deny hearing her to avoid empowering rivals. Historical records occasionally mention banshee beliefs in official contexts. Estate documents, legal disputes over inheritance, even military records sometimes reference whether someone came from a banshee family. This wasn't treated as fiction or folklore. It was treated as relevant biographical information, like noting someone's religion or place of birth. The banshee's reality was sufficiently accepted that she appeared in serious administrative documents, another testament to how deeply the belief penetrated Irish society. Here's what we need to understand. The banshee's selectivity wasn't arbitrary. It reflected and reinforced real social structures. It turned supernatural belief into a marker of status that couldn't be faked or bought. It created vertical continuity across generations, linking ancestors to descendants through recurring supernatural encounters. And it gave families a way to maintain identity and pride even when everything else, land, wealth, political power, was stripped away. The banshee was memory made audible, ancestry made manifest, identity proven through otherworldly attention. Let's bring this together. The banshee followed certain bloodlines because those bloodlines represented something important to Irish cultural identity. They were the families who embodied continuity with ancient Gaelic Ireland, with the time before conquest and colonization. Claiming a banshee was claiming a place in that unbroken line. It was asserting that you belonged to Ireland in a way that couldn't be revoked by political authority. The supernatural realm itself vouched for you. And in a culture that took the supernatural seriously, that validation mattered enormously. But if the banshee chose your family, how would you recognize her when she came? Her appearance was as varied and significant as her cry, changing from encounter to encounter in ways that carried their own meanings. The banshee's form tells you something crucial about belief, symbolism, and how humans visualize death itself. This isn't about one ghost with a fixed appearance. It's about how a single supernatural entity could shapeshift to match the needs of the moment, reflecting both the nature of impending death and the cultural baggage the witness brought to the encounter. Understanding her appearance means understanding how visual symbolism works in folklore and why the same spirit could terrify one person and fascinate another. Let's look at her many faces. The fundamental contradiction defines her. The banshee appeared both as a young, beautiful maiden and as an ancient, withered crone. These weren't different entities. The same banshee could manifest either way, or sometimes in forms that blended both. This duality wasn't a mistake or confusion. It was the point. She embodied the full spectrum of female life and death, maiden and crone, beauty and decay, life's beginning and its ending. To see her was to see multiple truths about mortality at once. Let's organize this into 3 clear sections: the dual forms and what they meant, the symbolic objects and clothing associated with her, and how regional variations created different local traditions. First, the dual forms. When the banshee appeared as a young woman, witnesses described her as pale, ethereally beautiful, with long flowing hair, usually white, silver, or pale blonde. Her skin was described as luminous, almost translucent, glowing with inner light that wasn't quite natural. Her eyes were often red from weeping, or sometimes described as having no color at all, empty white orbs that looked through you rather than at you. She moved gracefully, sometimes seeming to glide rather than walk. Everything about this form emphasized otherworldly beauty that attracted even as it repelled. This maiden form carried specific symbolic weight. Youth and beauty in Celtic tradition were associated with the otherworld itself, with a timeless realm where inhabitants didn't age or decay. Seeing the Banshee as a young woman suggested she came from that eternal place, that she wasn't bound by mortal limits. Her beauty also created cognitive dissonance. Beautiful things should be welcoming, safe, but her beauty was cold, removed, fundamentally inhuman. This made her more disturbing than simple ugliness would have been. She violated expectations about what beauty meant. The young Banshee also represented the life being cut short. When a young person was going to die, seeing her in maiden form reflected that tragedy. You were looking at what they could have been, the life they wouldn't live, personified. This made the encounter emotionally complex. It wasn't just frightening, it was heartbreaking. The Banshee's beauty became a mirror for potential lost. Now contrast this with her crone form. When appearing as an old woman, the Banshee was described as withered, hunched, dressed in ragged clothing or burial shrouds. Her hair was wild and unkempt, tangled and thin. Her face was deeply lined, sometimes described as skeletal, skin stretched tight over bone. Her hands were gnarled and bony, with long nails like claws. Her movements were jerky and unsettling. Everything about this form emphasized decay, the reality of death as physical dissolution. The crone form appeared more commonly when elderly family members were dying. She reflected the natural order, life coming to its appointed end. But she also represented death's inevitability. Age comes for everyone who lives long enough. The crone Banshee was a memento mori made flesh, a walking reminder that all beauty fades, all strength fails, all life ends in the same place. Looking at her meant confronting your own eventual fate. Here's what's fascinating. Some accounts describe the Banshee transforming during the encounter itself. A witness would see a beautiful maiden who would age before their eyes, becoming the crone in moments. Or the process reversed, the crone growing younger. This transformation was perhaps the most disturbing version of all. It showed the entire life cycle compressed into seconds. Birth to death in a single viewing. It forced the witness to see all of human existence as a continuous flow rather than discrete stages. This brings us to clothing and symbolic objects. The Banshee's clothes carried meaning equal to her physical form. Most commonly, she wore white or grey, colours associated with death and mourning in Irish tradition. Sometimes witnesses described her in a white dress or gown, flowing and simple. Other times she wore what appeared to be a burial shroud, the cloth used to wrap corpses. A few accounts mention green, but a specific shade, pale green like new leaves, connecting her to the fairy realm and ancient nature spirits. The burial shroud is particularly significant. When the Banshee wore this, she made explicit her connection to death. She became death's representative, death's announcer wearing death's clothing. Some witnesses reported that the shroud seemed to be stained, either with earth from graves or with blood. These stains told their own story. Earth stains connected her to burial, to the body's return to soil. Bloodstains suggested violent death, death in battle or by murder, death that came unnaturally. Now let's talk about the silver comb. This object appears repeatedly in Banshee lore across different regions and different time periods. Witnesses would describe seeing the Banshee sitting by a river or stream, combing her long hair with a silver comb. Sometimes she would leave the comb behind, or a witness would be tempted to pick it up. Every version of this story includes a warning. Never touch the banshee's comb. To take it brought disaster. You would die shortly after, or you would go mad, or you would be carried away into the fairy realm. The comb carries layered symbolism. Silver was associated with the moon, with femininity, with magic. A comb represents vanity, but also preparation. Women comb their hair before important events. The banshee combing hers suggested she was preparing for something, for the death she came to announce. The act of combing also creates a rhythmic, repetitive motion, almost meditative. It made her seem absorbed in her task, not immediately threatening, which made the danger somehow worse. In Irish fairy lore, accepting gifts from fairy beings created bonds of obligation. Taking the banshee's comb meant entering into relationship with her, with death itself. It meant crossing a boundary that should remain intact. The prohibition against touching it was a warning about boundaries generally. Don't reach into the supernatural realm. Don't try to possess what belongs to death. Stay in your lane. Consider this ripple effect. The silver comb appears in stories from across Ireland, but with regional variations in detail. In Ulster, the comb might have 9 teeth, a number with magical significance. In Munster, it might be described as elaborately decorated with Celtic knotwork. In Connaught, stories might emphasize the sound of the combing, a soft scraping noise that could be heard before the banshee herself was visible. These variations show how a core symbol was adapted by different communities to fit local storytelling traditions, while maintaining its essential meaning. Regional variations extended beyond the comb to the banshee's entire appearance and behavior. Ulster banshees were often described as more violent and frightening in their manifestations. They might appear covered in blood or floating above the ground in unsettling ways. This reflected Ulster's history as Ireland's most contested region, where violence was more common and death came more often through battle than old age. Munster banshees were often described in more sorrowful terms. They appeared weeping, overcome with genuine grief, making them seem more sympathetic even while frightening. Munster had rich traditions of poetry and music, arts that dealt with emotion and expression. The banshee in Munster stories reflected that cultural emphasis, becoming a figure of profound sadness rather than simple terror. Connaught banshees had strong associations with water. They appeared near rivers, lakes, and streams more consistently than in other regions. Connaught's landscape is defined by water, by Lough Corrib, and countless smaller bodies of water threading through the countryside. The banshee adapted to that landscape, making water her primary haunt. Leinster, the eastern province closest to English influence, had banshee traditions that showed more Christian influence. Leinster banshees might carry rosary beads, or their appearance might be described in ways that emphasize sin and judgment rather than ancient Celtic otherworld connections. This reflected Leinster's history of earlier and deeper contact with English colonial culture and its accompanying religious intensity. The banshee washing bloody clothes in a river appears across all regions, but was especially prominent in areas with histories of clan warfare. This image is powerful and specific. The banshee would be found at a riverside ford, washing what appeared to be clothes or shrouds. As you approached, you'd see the water running red with blood. Sometimes the clothes belonged to the person about to die. Sometimes they were generic burial shrouds representing death generally. Always the message was clear. Death was being prepared for, made ready, attended to. This washing motif connects to Bean Nige, the washerwoman, sometimes considered a separate entity from the Banshee, sometimes considered an aspect of her. The distinctions get fuzzy. Both were female spirits connected to death. Both appeared near water. Both announced coming mortality. Whether they were the same being, in different moods or different beings with overlapping functions depended on who you asked and what tradition they followed. Her form was said to reflect the nature of the coming death. A violent death might summon the blood-stained version of the Banshee, covered in gore, frightening in her explicit connection to the violence ahead. A peaceful death in old age might bring the gentler, sorrowful version, pale and weeping, but not actively terrifying. A death by drowning might bring the water-associated version, soaking wet, hair dripping, emerging from the element that would claim the victim. This adaptability made the Banshee more powerful as a symbol. She wasn't locked into one meaning. She could shift to match circumstances, becoming whatever aspect of death needed to be announced. This flexibility also made her harder to dismiss. If witnesses described wildly different appearances, skeptics might say they were seeing different things and the whole phenomenon was imaginary. But believers could counter that, of course, she looked different. She was responding to different situations. Her variability proved her authenticity. The color of her hair carried meaning. White or silver suggested great age or otherworldly nature, since white hair didn't occur naturally in young women. Red hair connected to Irish identity more broadly and to ancient Celtic associations between red hair and supernatural power. Black hair appeared less commonly, but suggested tragedy and darkness when it did. Witnesses paid attention to these details, seeking clues about what kind of death approached. Her eyes were described in ways that emphasized their inhumanity. They were too bright, glowing with their own light, or they were too dark, empty voids, or they were crying blood instead of tears, or they had no pupils, just uniform white or grey. Normal human eyes create connection. They're how we read each other's emotions and intentions. The Banshee's inhuman eyes denied that connection. You couldn't read her. You couldn't relate to her. She remained fundamentally other no matter how human her overall form appeared. Some descriptions mention her hands specifically. When appearing as a young woman, her hands might be described as delicate but cold, corpse cold to the touch if anyone was foolish or unlucky enough to feel them. When appearing as a crone, her hands were gnarled, arthritic, but strong with supernatural strength. The hands that washed blood from clothes, that combed endlessly through hair, that clutched at witnesses in some accounts, these hands performed death's work. Her feet, when visible, were sometimes described as bare, connecting her to earth and nature. Other times, she appeared to have no feet at all, floating or gliding without need for physical contact with ground. This detail separated her from living women. Real women's feet get dirty and tired. The Banshee was above such mortal concerns. She didn't walk the earth. She moved through it. Let's bring this together. The Banshee's changing appearance wasn't confusion or inconsistency. It was sophisticated symbolism. Each form reflected different aspects of death. different cultural associations with female life stages, different emotional tones for different types of loss. She could be beautiful or hideous, young or old, sorrowful or frightening, because death itself takes all these forms. Sometimes it comes gently to the elderly. Sometimes it rips away the young and beautiful. Sometimes it arrives with violence, sometimes with quiet fading. The banshee's appearance matched the death she announced, giving witnesses visual warning about what kind of loss approached. But the banshee wasn't just a frightening figure disconnected from human culture. She grew from very real Irish traditions about mourning and the women who gave voice to grief itself. The banshee makes complete sense once you understand keening, and keening explains something profound about grief, gender, and how communities process loss. This isn't just about a ghost story. It's about how real women performed essential emotional work in their communities, and how that work was understood as so powerful it generated its own supernatural echo. Understanding keening means understanding why the Irish gave death a female voice, and why that voice needed to be heard by everyone. Let's explore where folklore and reality blur. Keening was a real practice with documented history stretching back centuries. The Irish word is caoined, pronounced roughly cíne, meaning lamentation. At Irish funerals, especially in rural areas, women would be hired or would volunteer to keen for the deceased. This meant wailing, crying out, singing mourning songs in a specific vocal style designed to express and amplify grief. It wasn't quiet weeping. It was loud, public, emotional display that could be heard across considerable distances. Let's break this into 3 sections. The practice of keening itself, why only women performed this role, and how the banshee emerged as the supernatural version of these very real women. First, what did keening actually involve? The keening woman, sometimes called a bean cowint, would begin with a cry, a high-pitched wail that rose and fell in specific melodic patterns. These weren't random screams. They followed traditional forms, musical structures passed down through generations. The keen often incorporated words, improvised poetry praising the deceased, recounting their virtues, lamenting their loss. This poetry followed metrical rules, rhyme schemes, specific formats that marked it as formal rather than spontaneous. The sound itself was designed to be emotionally overwhelming. The keener used her voice as an instrument, creating sounds that bypassed rational thought and struck directly at the heart. Witnesses consistently described keening as one of the most moving, disturbing sounds they'd ever heard. It made you weep, even if you didn't know. Derte, deceased. It pulled grief out of you whether you wanted to feel it or not. This was the point. The keen created communal emotional experience, ensuring everyone present fully felt the weight of the loss. Professional keeners developed their craft over years. They learned from older keeners, practicing the vocal techniques, memorizing traditional verses, while also developing skill at improvisation. A good keener could craft a personalized lament on the spot, weaving in specific details about the deceased's life, their relationships, their accomplishments. This made each keen unique even while following traditional patterns. It was both ancient art form and immediate emotional expression. Keening happened at specific points in the funeral process. When the body was first washed and prepared, keeners would be present, their cries announcing to the community that death had occurred. During the wake, As people came to pay respects, keening would continue at intervals, creating waves of emotional intensity. During the funeral procession to the graveyard, keeners walked alongside the coffin, their voices carrying across the landscape. At the graveside, the final keen would be performed as the body was lowered into earth. The sound of keening was described in ways that mirror descriptions of the banshee cry. Fox-like shrieks, howling wind made human, wordless wailing interspersed with articulate poetry. The same vocabulary appears in both contexts because the sounds were genuinely similar. The banshee's supernatural cry was modelled on, or emerged from, the very real cries of human keeners. The line between folklore and reality was paper-thin here. Here's what made keening so powerful. It gave permission for extreme emotional expression. Irish culture, like most European cultures, expected people, especially men, to maintain composure in public. Excessive emotion was seen as weakness or loss of control. But grief is a powerful force. It needs outlet. Keening created a sanctioned space where extreme emotion was not only permitted, but required. The keener modelled how to grieve. She showed it is acceptable, even necessary, to wail and cry and express anguish loudly. This gave everyone else permission to release their own grief. Consider this ripple effect. When a keener performed, she wasn't just expressing her own emotions. She was performing grief on behalf of the entire community. She became a vessel through which collective loss could flow. People who couldn't access their own grief, who were too shocked or too controlled, could experience it through her. She did the emotional work they couldn't do themselves. This was recognized as valuable, essential even. That's why keeners were paid or compensated in kind. Their service was as important as the priests, the gravediggers, any other funeral functionary. This brings us to our second section. Why was keening exclusively women's work? The answer connects to broader patterns in how traditional societies divided labor by gender. Women were associated with birth and death, the beginning and end of life. Midwives attended births. Keeners attended deaths. Both were female-dominated roles dealing with life's most profound transitions. Men dominated the middle, the active years of work and warfare and politics. But the boundaries, the thresholds, those belonged to women. Culturally, women were believed to have special capacity for emotional expression. Whether this is biologically true or culturally constructed is debatable, but traditional Irish culture certainly believed it. Women could cry, could wail, could express feelings men were expected to suppress. This made them ideal for roles requiring public emotional display. A man keening would have been scandalous, inappropriate, threatening to social order. A woman keening was natural, expected, proper. There's also a practical element. In rural Irish communities, women had strong social networks with other women. They gathered for work, for market days, for religious observances. They knew each other's families, histories, relationships. This gave them the social knowledge needed to craft personalized laments. A good keener knew or could quickly learn who the deceased was, who they left behind, what mattered about their life. She could weave that knowledge into her keen, making it specific and therefore more powerful. Older women especially served as keeners. They had experience with death, having attended many funerals over long lives. They understood grief from personal experience. They'd lost husbands, children, siblings, friends. When they keened, they brought that accumulated sorrow into their performance. They weren't faking it. They were channeling real grief, their own and everyone else's, into ritualized expression. Their age also gave them authority. A young woman keening might seem performative. An old woman keening felt authentic, weighted with lived experience. The banshee emerges clearly as the supernatural extension of these human keeners. She is the ultimate keening woman, the arch-keener, the one who mourns not for payment or social obligation, but because she is bound to certain families by ancient ties. She is what keeners symbolize made literal. She is grief given supernatural form. Think about the parallels. Human keeners were hired or invited to attend deaths in specific families. Families they had relationships with over time. The banshee was attached to specific families by supernatural bonds. Human keeners announced death through their cries, letting the community know loss had occurred. The banshee announced death before it happened, her cry a warning rather than a response, but serving the same communicative function. Human keeners performed at specific times and places, following death rituals. The banshee appeared at liminal times and places, following supernatural patterns that mirrored human ritual. The banshee even looked like an idealized or exaggerated keener. The pale dress could be the simple clothing an older keening woman might wear. The long, unbound hair matched how keeners traditionally appeared, hair loose as sign of mourning. The red eyes from constant weeping perfectly fit someone whose profession was tears, and the voice, that supernatural cry, was just the human keen amplified, perfected, made eternal. Here's where it gets really interesting. In some communities, there was genuine confusion about whether a sound was a human keener or the banshee. Someone might hear keening in the distance and initially think it was a wake they didn't know about. Then they'd realize no one had died, or the sound was coming from an impossible location, and they'd reinterpret it as supernatural. Or the reverse. Someone would hear what they thought was the banshee, prepare for a death, then discover it had been old Mary performing a keen at a wake across the valley, the sound carrying further than expected. This blurred line was culturally productive. It meant the supernatural and natural reinforced each other constantly. Real keening reminded people of the banshee. Banshee stories reminded people of keening's power. Each made the other more believable, more significant. They existed in feedback loop, each validating the other. The Catholic Church had complicated feelings about keening. On one hand, it was deeply traditional, part of Irish identity, emotionally cathartic. On the other hand, it seemed pagan, excessively emotional, potentially inappropriate. Some priests tried to suppress keening, arguing it was unchristian, too focused on earthly loss rather than heavenly gain. They wanted quiet, dignified funerals centered on prayer and ritual, but they largely failed. Keening persisted because communities insisted on it. It met needs the church couldn't meet. It gave voice to grief in ways official religion didn't. The church's ambivalence toward keening paralleled its ambivalence toward the banshee. Both were uncomfortable pagan survivals. Both were too popular to successfully eliminate. Both served functions that Catholic ritual didn't quite cover. The solution was again strategic accommodation. Keening could continue as long as it didn't completely overshadow Christian elements of the funeral. The banshee could be believed in as long as people didn't worship her or treat her as more important than God. Modern observers sometimes romanticize keening or dismiss it as primitive. Both miss the point. Keening was sophisticated emotional technology. It was a developed art form using voice and poetry to facilitate psychological processing of loss. It created communal grieving experiences that helped people move through trauma together. It gave voice to feelings that might otherwise have remained trapped and toxic. It was, in its way, an early form of group therapy, built into cultural practice. The decline of keening in the 19th and 20th centuries happened for multiple reasons. Modernization and urbanization broke up rural communities where everyone knew everyone. Professional keeners couldn't function in cities where they had no personal connection to the deceased. The Catholic Church's continued pressure eventually had effect. Younger generations, especially those educated in English rather than Irish, saw keening as embarrassing, backward, something their ignorant ancestors did. By the mid-20th century, keening had largely died out, except in the most remote areas, but the banshee remained in folklore and imagination, even after keening disappeared. This makes sense. The supernatural can survive the death of the practices that birthed it. The banshee became memory of keening, a reminder that Irish culture once processed death differently, loudly, with female voices raised in lamentation. She preserved in ghostly form what modernity had eliminated from practice. Let's bring this together. The banshee and keening women were two manifestations of the same cultural phenomenon. The belief that death required female vocal expression, that grief needed to be heard, that certain women had special capacity to access and express the emotional truth of loss. The keeners were the human version, performing essential emotional labor for their communities. The banshee was the idealized supernatural version, the eternal keener, whose mourning began before death itself. Understanding their connection reveals how deeply the Irish understood grief's power and how carefully they created cultural structures to contain and express it. And when she performed her supernatural keenness, when the banshee raised her voice in that legendary cry, the sound itself became the center of the legend, an unforgettable acoustic experience that defined Irish attitudes toward death for generations. Sound is primal in ways vision isn't, and the banshee understood this perfectly. This isn't about academic analysis of folklore. It's about how certain sounds bypass your conscious mind and trigger responses you can't control. About why acoustic phenomena create stronger memories than visual ones, and about what happens when an entire culture agrees that a specific sound means something terrible. Understanding the banshee's cry means understanding how sound shapes fear and memory. Let's listen carefully to what shook Ireland to its core. The Irish Folklore Commission, established in the 1930s, systematically collected testimony from thousands of people across Ireland about traditional beliefs and practices. Their archives contain hundreds of accounts describing the banshee's cry, recorded from people in different counties, different decades, different social classes. What's remarkable is the consistency. Despite geographic separation and no way for these witnesses to coordinate their stories, they describe the same sound using the same vocabulary. This consistency either means the phenomenon was real, or it means Irish culture had such a powerful shared understanding of what the banshee cry should sound like that people unconsciously match their reports to the template. Let's organize this into 3 sections: the specific qualities of the sound itself, the emotional and physical responses it triggered, and how the cry functioned as cultural memory and certainty. First, what did witnesses actually hear? The most common description compared it to a fox's scream. If you've never heard a fox scream, imagine the most unsettling sound you can think of. Something that sounds like a woman being murdered but coming from an animal. Fox screams are high-pitched, piercing, with a quality that sounds almost but not quite human. They trigger alarm responses automatically. Your heart rate spikes. Your attention locks onto the sound. Evolution wired mammals to pay attention to distress calls, and fox screams hit that button hard. But witnesses always added that the banshee cry wasn't exactly like a fox. It was similar, but wronger. It had qualities no animal sound had. Some described it as having words buried in the wail, not clear enough to understand, but present enough to be disturbing. You almost heard language in it. This created cognitive dissonance. Animal or human, natural or supernatural. Your brain couldn't categorize it, which made the experience more frightening than a clearly identifiable sound would have been. Other comparisons referenced wind, specifically wind howling through a narrow gap, through a keyhole or crack in shutters. This creates a high whistling quality with variations in pitch as the wind shifts. But again, the banshee cry added something. It was wind that seemed intentional, wind that had emotion in it, wind that was trying to communicate. Natural wind is random. The banshee's cry had purpose and direction, even when it seemed to come from everywhere at once. A third common comparison was a cat in agony. Cats in pain produce terrible sounds, yowls that seem too loud and too emotionally laden to come from such small animals. There's something in cat distress calls that humans find particularly disturbing. The banshee cry allegedly shared this quality of seeming wrong, too emotionally intense, coming from a source you couldn't see or locate. It violated your sense of how sound should work in physical space. The pitch was consistently described as high, at the upper range of human hearing or even beyond it. High-pitched sounds are naturally more piercing, more attention-grabbing than low sounds. They travel well through night air. They penetrate walls and windows. They're harder to ignore or block out. The banshee chose her register wisely, if we can attribute strategy to a supernatural entity. The pattern of the cry mattered as much as its quality. Most accounts describe it coming in waves, rising and falling, not a constant sound, but a series of cries with silence between. This pattern had several effects. First, it prevented habituation. If the sound were constant, your nervous system would eventually start ignoring it. But intermittent sounds keep you on edge. You can't tune them out. Each new cry grabs your attention again. Second, the silences between cries were almost worse than the sounds. You waited in the quiet, knowing another cry was coming, but not when. This anticipatory dread was psychologically devastating. Some described the cry as moving, circling a house, or traveling from one location to another. This added to the disorientation. You couldn't locate the source. It seemed to defy physical laws about how sound propagates. One moment it was by the window, the next by the door, then distant on the road, then right outside again. This impossible movement marked the sound as supernatural. Natural sounds come from fixed locations. The banshee's cry came from nowhere and everywhere. Duration varied in accounts. Some described a brief cry, seconds long, then nothing. Others described extended wailing that went on for minutes, or even, in memory, hours. Time perception gets distorted during frightening experiences. What felt like an hour might have been 5 minutes. But the subjective experience mattered more than objective duration. It felt endless. It felt like it would never stop. That's what terror does to time. This brings us to our second section: how people reacted physically and emotionally to the cry. The responses were remarkably consistent across accounts. First came paralysis. Witnesses described being frozen in place, unable to move even when they wanted to run or investigate. This involuntary immobility is a real stress response. Faced with extreme fear, the nervous system sometimes chooses freeze over fight or flight. You're literally incapable of moving. Your muscles lock. You stand or sit exactly where you are, unable to do anything but listen. Tears were nearly universal. People described crying without sadness, tears streaming down their faces not from grief, but from some involuntary response to the sound. This makes physiological sense. The cry triggered deep emotional centers in the brain. The body responded with tears even before the conscious mind understood why. You were crying before you knew what you were crying about. Heart palpitations, shortness of breath, cold sweats. These standard fear responses appeared in account after account: trembling hands, nausea. These are classic panic attack symptoms. The banshee cry triggered full body stress responses that took hours to subside. Some witnesses described still feeling physically ill the next day, their bodies depleted from the intensity of their fear response. This wasn't just being startled. It was profound physiological trauma condensed into minutes. Sleep became impossible after hearing the cry. Even if someone managed to go back to bed, they'd lie awake, every small sound making them tense, afraid the cry would return. Children who heard it often had nightmares for weeks or months afterward. Adults described a lingering sense of dread, a background anxiety that colored everything until the predicted death occurred and confirmed the warning. This extended psychological impact shows how deeply the sound affected people. It wasn't just a momentary scare. It altered their mental state for days or weeks. Households experienced the cry collectively, which added another dimension. When multiple people hear the same strange sound simultaneously, it validates the experience. You can't dismiss it as imagination or dream. 5 people don't simultaneously imagine the same impossible sound. This collective witnessing created shared trauma, but also shared certainty. Everyone in the house now knew death was coming. They could compare their perceptions, confirm details, support each other through the dread of waiting. This communal aspect transformed personal fear into family crisis. Interestingly, not everyone in a household always heard the cry equally. Sometimes one person heard it clearly, while others heard only something vague and disturbing. Sometimes children heard it when adults didn't, or vice versa. These differences created interesting dynamics. The person who heard it most clearly often became the authority on the experience, interpreting what it meant, predicting whose death it announced. This gave them temporary power within the family structure, though it was power nobody wanted. The emotional tone of the responses went beyond simple fear. People described feeling profound sadness, overwhelming grief washing over them before they consciously understood why. The cry carried emotional content, not just acoustic content. It made you feel the coming loss before the loss occurred. This preemptive grief is psychologically complex. You're mourning someone still alive. You're grieving a future that hasn't happened yet. This temporal confusion added to the distress. Some witnesses described anger alongside fear and sadness. Anger at being forced to know death was coming. Anger at the helplessness of receiving a warning you couldn't use to prevent anything. Anger at the supernatural realm for interfering in human affairs. This rage had no outlet. You couldn't fight the banshee or reason with her. You could only endure her message and your own emotional chaos. Now let's explore our third section, how the banshee cry functioned as cultural memory and created certainty about death. The sound became a marker, a dividing line between before and after. Before the cry, everything was normal. Death was abstract. After the cry, death became immediate reality waiting to manifest. This temporal marking function was psychologically important. It created clear narrative structure around loss. You knew when the story began. You waited for the middle. You anticipated the ending. The cry also created cultural continuity across generations. Grandparents described hearing it. Parents described hearing it. Children grew up knowing they might hear it someday. This created expectation and pattern recognition. When you heard a strange sound at night, your mind immediately considered, is this the banshee? Cultural memory primed you to interpret ambiguous acoustic events as potentially supernatural. This made the belief self-perpetuating. Expectation shaped interpretation. Villages developed collective memory around specific banshee episodes. The night the banshee cried for old O'Connor became a reference point. Time was measured relative to it. That was 2 years before the banshee cried for O'Connor. My daughter was born the spring after the banshee came for the O'Neill. The cry became part of a community history, a shared event that everyone remembered and referenced. This gave the phenomenon social weight beyond individual belief. The certainty that followed the cry is psychologically fascinating. Once you heard it, you knew with absolute conviction that someone in your family would die, not might die, would die. This certainty wasn't logical. It was visceral, unshakable. Even skeptics, people who claimed not to believe in superstition, found this certainty settling over them. Something about the experience bypassed rational doubt. You just knew. This knowing then shaped behavior and perception. Families entered a state of heightened vigilance after a banshee warning. They watched family members for signs of illness. They worried about those traveling, those in dangerous occupations. They attended more carefully to elderly relatives. This hypervigilance served a psychological function. It gave you something to do, some way to exert agency in a situation where you'd been told you were powerless. You couldn't prevent the death, but you could be ready for it. You could try to identify who was at risk. This often created a self-fulfilling prophecy dynamic. Increased attention meant you noticed things you'd normally miss. Someone's cough seemed more serious because you were listening for signs of doom. An ache or pain that would normally be dismissed became potential evidence. Someone's planned trip suddenly seemed fraught with danger. You projected significance onto normal life events because you were expecting tragedy. When death eventually came, even if it was unrelated to the things you'd been worrying about, it confirmed the banshee's warning and reinforced belief in her power. The acoustic qualities of the cry made it memorable in ways visual experiences aren't. Sound bypasses some of the brain's rational processing. It hits emotional centers directly. Auditory memories are often more emotionally charged than visual ones. You might forget what someone looked like, but you never forget the sound of their voice, especially if that voice delivered traumatic information. The banshee cry embedded itself in memory because it entered through channels designed to hold sound-based information about threats. Music and sound have power in Irish culture more broadly. Traditional Irish music isn't just entertainment. It's emotional expression, cultural identity, historical record. Songs passed down stories for generations before literacy was common. The banshee cry functioned as a kind of anti-song, a melody of death that was nevertheless recognized as important acoustic cultural information. It deserved to be remembered and retold because it carried meaning essential to understanding your place in the cultural pattern. Let's also consider the cries that didn't come. When someone died unexpectedly without a banshee warning, this created cognitive dissonance for believers. How could the banshee fail to warn? Several explanations were possible. Perhaps someone heard her, but didn't recognize it, or didn't report it. Perhaps the deceased wasn't important enough to the family line to warrant warning. Perhaps the death came from outside the natural order, an accident or violence that even the supernatural realm didn't foresee. Each explanation preserved the belief system while accommodating the exception. The cry also functioned as validation that Irish culture maintained connection to ancient ways. In an era of increasing English influence, the banshee cry proved that Ireland remained distinct, special, attended by forces that didn't bother with other nations. The English didn't have banshees. This marked the Irish as different, connected to deeper magic and older truths. The cry wasn't just frightening, it was oddly comforting. It meant you belonged to something the modern world couldn't touch or explain away. Modern recordings don't exist, of course. By the time recording technology reached rural Ireland, banshee reports had declined. We have only testimony, descriptions filtered through memory and language. Some folklorists tried to recreate the sound based on descriptions, using human voices or instruments to approximate what witnesses reported. These recreations are haunting and disturbing, but they're interpretations, not the real thing. The actual cry, if it ever existed as a consistent acoustic phenomenon, is lost to time, yet the memory persists. People in modern Ireland still know what the phrase banshee cry means. It refers to something terrible, an omen of death, a sound that would freeze your blood. The phrase entered the language as shorthand for supernatural terror. This shows the cry's cultural power. Even people who don't believe in the banshee know what her cry supposedly meant. The sound outlived its own existence, surviving as concept and symbol. Let's wrap this together. The banshee's cry was described consistently across centuries and counties, suggesting either a real acoustic phenomenon or a cultural agreement so strong it shaped perception. The sound combined familiar elements, animal cries, wind, human wailing, into something that couldn't be categorized as natural. It triggered profound physiological and emotional responses that lasted long after the sound ended, and it created certainty, a deep conviction that death was approaching, which structured how families processed loss and maintained cultural identity. The cry was the legend's most powerful element because sound operates on humans at a level consciousness can't fully control. But the banshee didn't just wail anywhere or any time. Her appearances followed patterns, occurring at specific places and moments that themselves carried symbolic weight. and revealed the logic underlying supernatural belief. Place and time aren't neutral in folklore, and understanding where and when the Banshee appeared reveals something crucial about how humans create meaning from geography and chronology. This isn't just about a ghost choosing locations. It's about how certain places and times feel charged with possibility, how boundaries in space and time become supernatural territories, and why the in-between matters more than destinations. Understanding the Banshee's patterns means understanding how humans make sense of transition itself. Let's map her territory. The Banshee was fundamentally a threshold entity. She appeared at boundaries, at places where one thing became another, at moments when normal rules seemed suspended. This wasn't random. It reflected deep patterns in how human consciousness processes change and transition. We're uncomfortable with in-between states. We like clear categories. The Banshee exploited that discomfort, manifesting precisely where definition became fuzzy and uncertainty ruled. Let's break this into 3 clear sections: the temporal patterns of her appearances, the specific types of places she haunted, and what these patterns reveal about the supernatural logic governing her behavior. First, when did she appear? Overwhelmingly, at night. This seems obvious. Ghosts come at night, but the pattern reveals deeper meaning. Night wasn't just dark. It was liminal time, the boundary between days. When you're awake at night, you exist in a suspended state. You should be sleeping, but you're conscious. Time feels different. The normal structure of day, work, meals, social interaction, all of that collapses. Night, especially deep night around midnight, was considered the moment when the veil between worlds wore thinnest. Midnight specifically appears repeatedly in accounts. Midnight is neither yesterday nor tomorrow. It's the instant of transition, the moment when one day becomes another. Traditional belief held that supernatural beings had special power at midnight. Church bells at midnight were meant to drive away evil spirits precisely because midnight was dangerous, a time when protective boundaries weakened. The Banshee appeared at midnight because that was when she could most easily cross from her realm into ours. The hours just before dawn were also significant. This period, when night starts yielding to day but darkness still dominates, has always been associated with spirits and death. Many people die in these hours, their bodies finally releasing as night ends. The Banshee, appearing in this pre-dawn darkness, made intuitive sense. She announced death in the very hours when death most often came. Her appearances clustered around certain times of year, particularly around Samhain, the festival at the end of October that marked summer's end and winter's beginning. Samhain was the Celtic New Year, another threshold moment. The old year died, the new year began, and in that transition, the boundary between living and dead, mortal and supernatural dissolved. The Banshee was more active during Samhain because movement between worlds became easier. She didn't need to fight against the normal separation of realms. The calendar itself opened the door. Other traditional festival times showed similar patterns. Beltane, the May Day festival, was another moment of transition, winter yielding to summer. The quarter days that divided the Celtic year were all threshold moments, points of change when supernatural activity increased. The Banshee followed the ritual calendar, appearing more frequently at these culturally designated times of transformation. Moon phases mattered too. Full moons are obvious, lighting the night enough that encounters became possible. But reports also cluster around new moons, when darkness was absolute and the night felt most threatening. The moon's cycle is itself a pattern of transition, waxing and waning, being and non-being. The banshee's appearances tracked this celestial rhythm, suggesting she was attuned to cosmic patterns of change. Consider this ripple effect. These temporal patterns meant people were vigilant at specific times. You paid more attention on Samhain night. You were warier at midnight. You listened more carefully during new moons. This heightened attention made you more likely to notice sounds that might otherwise be dismissed. A fox screaming at 2 in the afternoon gets heard and categorized as fox. The same sound at midnight on Samhain becomes potentially supernatural. Context shaped interpretation, and temporal context was crucial. Now let's explore the places she haunted. Crossroads appear constantly in Banshee lore. Crossroads are geographic thresholds, places where paths intersect, and you must choose direction. In traditional belief, crossroads were spiritually dangerous. Multiple paths meeting created confusion, symbolically and supernaturally. Spirits could become trapped at crossroads. Supernatural beings gathered there. Suicides were buried at crossroads to confuse their ghosts, preventing them from finding their way home. The banshee appearing at crossroads fit perfectly into this complex of beliefs about geography and spirit movement. Riverbanks and streams were another primary location. Water is a universal boundary symbol. It separates one piece of land from another. Crossing water means entering new territory. In Irish mythology, many entrances to the other world were across or underwater. Bodies of water marked edges between the human realm and supernatural realms. The banshee appearing near water made symbolic sense. She was at a boundary. She belonged to the between spaces. The specific image of the banshee washing bloody clothes in a river adds layers to this water symbolism. Rivers flow, carrying things away. They're associated with cleansing, but also with endings, with things being taken downstream and lost. Washing clothes is domestic activity made sinister. It's preparation, getting ready for something. The blood makes it explicit. Someone is going to die, and she's preparing their burial shroud, washing it clean in preparation for dressing the corpse. This image combines water symbolism, domestic labor symbolism, and death preparation into a single powerful visual. Hedgerows were another common location. Hedgerows are boundaries in agricultural landscapes, marking where one field ends and another begins. They're also liminal ecological zones, neither fully open field nor fully closed woodland. They're in-between habitats where different species mix. For a threshold spirit, hedgerows were perfect territory. They literally existed at the edges, separating one thing from another. Windows appear frequently in accounts. People heard the banshee cry outside their window specifically. Windows are thresholds of a different kind, boundaries between inside and outside, between private domestic space and public world. They're transparent barriers. You can see through them, but can't easily pass through them. The banshee at the window was simultaneously outside and shockingly close, separated only by glass or shutters. This made her immediate but unreachable, a perfect position for delivering a message without physical contact. Doorways had similar significance. A door is the most obvious threshold, the design point of transition between in and out. Traditional Irish beliefs included many rules about doorways. Don't stand in an open doorway at certain times. Don't let certain things cross your threshold. blessed doorways to protect them. The banshee appearing near or at doors fit into this complex of threshold anxiety. She was at the designated crossing point, the place designed for movement between realms. Graveyards are almost too obvious, but they appear in banshee lore as well. Graveyards are thresholds between life and death made geographic. Dead bodies beneath the ground, living people visiting above. The boundary between states of being is physically marked. The banshee appearing in graveyards wasn't just atmospheric. It was being at the central boundary, the most literal manifestation of the life-death threshold she herself embodied. Abandoned buildings were also reported locations. Abandoned structures are thresholds between inhabited and wilderness. They were once domestic, human, civilized. Now they're empty, decaying, returning to nature. They exist in transition between two states. Supernatural beings often claim abandoned buildings precisely because they're in between places, no longer fully human, but not yet fully wild. Let's consider what these spatial patterns reveal about the supernatural logic governing the banshee. She wasn't random. She couldn't just appear anywhere. She was bound to specific types of locations that shared common characteristics. They were all boundaries, edges, places of transition and transformation. This suggests that the banshee, like other supernatural entities in Irish folklore, operated under rules. She had power, but it was channeled and limited. She could only manifest where the world itself created openings. This rule-bound nature of the supernatural is important for understanding folklore generally. Ghosts and spirits in Irish tradition weren't omnipotent. They worked within constraints. The banshee couldn't appear at noon in the middle of a well-lit parlour. She needed night, edges, threshold moments. These limitations made her more believable, more realistic in an odd way. A completely unconstrained supernatural being strains credibility. A being that follows natural laws, even supernatural natural laws, feels more possible. The temporal and spatial patterns also gave people frameworks for protection. Avoid crossroads at midnight. Don't linger by rivers after dark. Keep windows shuttered during Samhain. These were practical applications of understanding where and when the banshee appeared. You couldn't control her, but you could control your exposure to dangerous times and places. This gave people agency, a sense that they could protect themselves through knowledge and proper behavior. Interestingly, the banshee rarely appeared in churches or on consecrated ground. Churches were explicitly Christian space, blessed and protected. The banshee, emerging from pre-Christian tradition, apparently couldn't enter there easily. This created a spiritual geography, where some spaces were safe and others dangerous. People living in this belief system mentally mapped their landscape into zones of varying supernatural risk. Crossing from zone to zone required awareness and sometimes protective gestures, prayers, carrying blessed objects. The patterns also reinforced social behavior. People had practical reasons to avoid traveling alone at night, crossing rivers in darkness, or lingering at crossroads. These were genuinely dangerous in physical terms. Banshee beliefs added supernatural reinforcement to sensible precautions. Don't go out alone at night, or you might encounter the banshee became another way of saying, don't go out alone at night because you might fall, get lost, or encounter human dangers. The supernatural belief and practical safety worked in tandem. Let's bring this together. The Banshee appeared at specific times and places that shared a common feature. They were thresholds, boundaries, moments, and locations of transition. She manifested at midnight, at crossroads, near water, at windows, during liminal festivals. These patterns weren't random. They reflected a sophisticated understanding that certain times and places feel different, feel charged with possibility and danger. The Banshee exploited these natural human responses to transition and uncertainty, appearing precisely where and when people were already primed to experience the uncanny. Her consistency across accounts suggests either real phenomenon or cultural agreement so powerful it shaped perception identically across geography and time. But the Banshee didn't remain purely oral folklore whispered at firesides. She entered literature, poetry, and written records, transforming from local legend into national symbol and revealing how folklore moves between different cultural registers. The journey from whispered fireside tale to published literature to national symbol reveals something fundamental about how stories evolve and what happens when folklore enters written record. This isn't just about the Banshee becoming famous. It's about how oral culture and literate culture interact, how nationalism uses folklore for political ends, and how a local ghost becomes a badge of cultural identity. Understanding this transformation means understanding how Ireland itself changed and how the Banshee changed with it. Let's trace her evolution. Ireland had strong oral culture for centuries before widespread literacy. Stories weren't written down. They were performed, told aloud at gatherings, passed parent to child, elder to youth. The Banshee thrived in this oral environment. Each telling could adapt to the audience, emphasize different details, update the story with recent local encounters. Oral tradition is fluid, alive, constantly changing while maintaining core elements. The Banshee in oral culture was immediate, local, personal. She was about your family, your neighbor, your recent experience. Let's break this transformation into 3 sections. How storytelling culture spread and maintained the legend, how the Banshee entered written literary tradition, and how she became a symbol of Irish identity itself. First, the oral storytelling networks that kept the Banshee legend alive across centuries. Ireland's social structure facilitated story transmission beautifully. People gathered regularly at wakes, markets, festivals, pattern days, religious observances. These gatherings were information exchanges. You learned what happened in neighboring villages, which families experienced what events, who died and how. Banshee stories circulated naturally through these networks. Storytellers held special status in Irish culture. A good storyteller could hold an audience for hours, recounting epics, fairy tales, historical events, local gossip, all woven together into entertainment and education. Professional storytellers traveled between communities, carrying stories with them. A tale told in County Cork would reach County Donegal within months, adapted and changed but recognizable. The Banshee benefited from this system. She spread across the island not through books, but through voices, told and retold, until everyone knew her basic outline. Winter nights were particularly important for storytelling. When darkness came early and work was limited, people gathered indoors. Extended families, neighbors, sometimes entire small communities would crowd into cottages. With no electric light, no radio, no television, storytelling was primary entertainment. The Banshee was perfect winter night material. She was scary enough to thrill, meaningful enough to teach, Irish enough to reinforce identity. Young people heard the stories and absorbed them. They learned not just the plot, but the emotional tone, the proper way to react, the cultural significance. These gatherings also allowed for verification and elaboration. Someone would tell a banshee story, and others would chime in with their own experiences or family stories. Did you hear the banshee before your uncle died? Yes, and my grandmother heard her before that. This call and response pattern strengthened belief. It wasn't just one story. It was a web of interconnected testimonies that supported each other. Each telling referenced others, creating a network of mutually reinforcing narratives. Regional variations developed naturally in this oral system. A storyteller in Ulster told a story with Ulster details, Ulster family names, Ulster landscape features. Someone in Munster did the same with Munster specifics. But travellers between regions carried stories across boundaries, so there was cross-pollination. The banshee remained recognisably the same figure while adapting to local colour. This flexibility kept her relevant across Ireland's diverse regions and communities. The stories served multiple functions beyond entertainment. They taught young people about death, about family history, about proper behaviour. They reinforced social hierarchies by emphasizing which families had banshees. They provided frameworks for processing grief. They maintained connection to pre-Christian past, even as Christianity dominated official religion. And they asserted Irish distinctiveness. This isn't just any ghost story from anywhere. This is specifically Irish supernatural reality. Consider this ripple effect. As Ireland faced conquest, colonization, and cultural pressure to anglicize, the oral storytelling tradition became an act of resistance. Speaking Irish rather than English was political. Telling Irish stories rather than English stories was political. Maintaining belief in the banshee rather than adopting English rationalism was political. The stories became vehicles for preserving identity under threat. Every telling said, "We are Irish. We remain Irish. We have things the English don't have and don't understand." This brings us to our second section, how the banshee entered written literary tradition. The shift from oral to written fundamentally changed the legend's nature. Written stories are fixed. You can't adapt them to your audience. They don't respond to feedback. They become canon rather than fluid tradition. But writing also preserves, spreads further, reaches audiences impossible for oral tradition. The earliest written references to the banshee appear in 17th century texts, written by Irish scholars documenting their own traditions. These weren't literary stories. They were ethnographic descriptions, attempts to record Irish customs and beliefs before they disappeared under English pressure. The writers understood that oral tradition was fragile. Stories could be lost in a generation if circumstances disrupted transmission. Writing preserved what might otherwise vanish. 18th century antiquarians took increasing interest in Irish folklore. They collected stories, interviewed elder storytellers, compiled manuscripts cataloguing Irish traditions. Their motivations were mixed. Some genuinely loved Irish culture. Others were fascinated by primitive customs they considered quaint or backward. Either way, they created written records that preserved banshee lore in new forms. These collections circulated among educated classes, both Irish and English, spreading knowledge of the Banshee beyond the communities where oral tradition kept her alive. The 19th century saw explosion of Irish literary nationalism. Writers consciously used Irish folklore to assert cultural distinctiveness and political legitimacy. If Ireland had unique traditions, ancient culture, distinct identity, then Ireland deserved to be independent nation rather than English possession. Folklore became ammunition in political struggle. The Banshee was perfect for this purpose. She was distinctively Irish, ancient, mysterious, powerful. She proved Ireland had sophisticated supernatural traditions equal to any nation's. Poets incorporated the Banshee into their work. She appeared in ballads and verses throughout the 1800s, sometimes as atmosphere, sometimes as central figure. These poems spread through newspapers, pamphlets, recitation. They reached audiences beyond oral tradition's range, including Irish emigrants abroad. The poems standardized certain aspects of the legend while embellishing others. Poetic language made her more dramatic, more gothic, more romantic than oral tradition's often matter-of-fact accounts. William Butler Yeats, Ireland's most famous literary figure, included the Banshee in his folklore collections in the 1890s. Yeats was intensely interested in Irish supernatural beliefs, seeing them as a repository of ancient wisdom and poetic inspiration. He interviewed people about their experiences, recorded stories, and published them for wide audiences. His work gave the Banshee literary prestige. She wasn't just peasant superstition. She was material worthy of serious artistic attention. Lady Gregory, Yeats's collaborator, also collected and published Irish folklore extensively. Her work emphasized the dignity and sophistication of Irish oral tradition. She presented the Banshee not as ignorant superstition, but as complex cultural phenomenon worthy of respect. This framing was important for cultural nationalism. It said, "Our traditions are as legitimate as England's, our culture as valuable, our supernatural beliefs as meaningful as their literature and philosophy." These literary treatments changed the Banshee somewhat. Writers emphasized her beauty or horror for dramatic effect. They gave her more agency, more personality than oral tradition always did. They sometimes invented details to serve narrative purposes. Literary banshees could be more elaborate than oral ones because written stories need different elements than oral stories. But the core remained recognizable. She still cried for death. She still attached to certain families. She still embodied Irish supernatural reality. Songs carried the Banshee into popular culture in new ways. Ballads about the Banshee circulated widely, performed at gatherings, published as sheet music, recorded eventually on early recordings. Music reaches emotions differently than prose. A Banshee ballad could make you feel her grief, her eeriness, her power through melody and vocal performance. The songs kept her alive in popular imagination, even as traditional belief systems weakened under modernization. The 20th century saw the Banshee enter mass media. She appeared in films, both Irish and international. She showed up in novels by Irish and international authors. Radio plays featured her. Later, television programs included her. Each medium adapted her to its needs and audience. Hollywood made her more explicitly horrifying. Irish productions often treated her more reverently as cultural heritage. But all these appearances kept her circulating, kept her recognizable, prevented her from fading into obscurity. Now let's explore our third section, how the Banshee became a symbol of Irish identity itself. This is where folklore becomes nationalism, where a ghost becomes a flag. By the late 19th and early 20th century, Ireland was fighting for independence from Britain. Cultural distinctiveness was a key argument. We're not British, we're Irish. We have our own language, traditions, identity. Therefore, we deserve self-determination. The Banshee became evidence in this argument. She represented several things nationalists wanted to emphasize. First, ancient continuity. The Banshee's roots in pre-Christian Ireland proved Irish culture was older than English colonization, older than Christianity itself. Second, distinctiveness. The English didn't have banshees. This was specifically Irish. It marked Ireland as different, special, deserving of recognition. Third, sophistication. The Banshee legend was complex, nuanced, rich with symbolism. It proved Irish culture wasn't primitive, but had developed elaborate supernatural worldview. The Banshee also embodied qualities nationalists wanted to associate with Ireland: fierce independence, mystery, connection to land, and ancestry, female power. Ireland itself was often personified as woman in nationalist imagery. The Banshee fit that pattern. She was Ireland's voice crying out, warning her people, mourning her losses, refusing to be silenced. Educational materials and cultural programs promoted Irish folklore as part of building national identity. Children learned about the Banshee in school. Cultural organizations encouraged collecting and preserving folklore. The Irish Folklore Commission, established in 1935 after independence, systematically documented traditions including Banshee beliefs. This was nation-building work. You create national identity partly by defining what's distinctively yours. The Banshee was definitively Irish, therefore definitively part of what it meant to be Irish. Sports teams, businesses, cultural organizations sometimes took Banshee-related names. This marked them as authentically Irish, as connected to tradition. Using the Banshee's name or image said, "We're proud of our heritage. We embrace our folklore. We're not ashamed of being Irish." In a context where Irish identity had been denigrated by colonial power, this reclamation mattered enormously. The Banshee also served as shorthand in international contexts. If you needed to quickly signal, "This is Irish," the Banshee worked efficiently. She was recognizable even to non-Irish audiences as Irish symbol. She appeared on tourist materials, in international arts festivals, in cultural exchanges. She became ambassador for Irish supernatural tradition, representing entire complex folklore system through her singular recognizable form. Contemporary Irish writers and artists continued engaging with the Banshee, but often with irony or complication. Modern treatments sometimes question traditional gender roles embedded in the legend. Why is Death's herald female? What does it mean that women are associated with mourning and grief? These critical engagements showed the Banshee remained culturally alive, still generating meaning and debate rather than being dead historical artifact. The Banshee entered global popular culture in ways that sometimes diluted or changed her original meaning. Video games featured banshees as generic monsters. Fantasy novels included banshees disconnected from Irish context. Horror films used the name for creatures bearing little resemblance to traditional descriptions. This globalization spread awareness, but sometimes at cost of accuracy and cultural specificity. The Banshee became generic ghost rather than specifically Irish entity. Yet in Ireland itself, The Banshee retained more specific meaning. She remained connected to actual Irish families, Irish landscape, Irish cultural memory. Surveys in late 20th and early 21st century found that most Irish people still recognized the Banshee, knew the basic legend, and could identify her as an Irish symbol. Even people who didn't believe in her supernatural reality knew her cultural importance. She remained part of shared cultural literacy. Let's bring this together. The Banshee transformed from local oral legend to written literature to national symbol through processes that reflected Ireland's own transformation. As Ireland moved from colonized to independent, from oral to literate, from agricultural to modern, the Banshee adapted. She entered new media, served new purposes, carried new meanings, but she remained recognizably herself. The crying woman who announces death, the ancient spirit attached to Irish families, the voice that refuses to be silenced. Her journey from fireside tale to national icon shows how folklore works, how stories evolve, and how supernatural beliefs become identity markers that outlive the belief itself. And when the Irish left their homeland, scattering across the globe in waves of emigration, the Banshee went with them, adapting to new lands while maintaining her essential Irish identity. Migration changes people, but it also changes the stories they carry with them. This isn't just about Irish immigrants bringing folklore to America. It's about how cultural memory works in diaspora, how beliefs adapt to new contexts, and what happens when you try to maintain identity in a place that doesn't share your history. Understanding the Banshee in America means understanding the immigrant experience itself, the loneliness and longing that shape how people relate to their homeland stories. Let's follow her across the Atlantic. The great waves of Irish immigration to America came primarily in the mid to late 1800s, though Irish people had been arriving earlier and continued coming later. The famine in the 1840s drove massive migration. Political upheaval, economic hardship, and the promise of opportunity pulled millions from Ireland to American shores. They settled in Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Chicago, San Francisco, and countless smaller cities and towns. They brought very little materially, but they brought their stories. Let's organize this into 3 sections: how immigrants carried and maintained Banshee beliefs, how the legend adapted to American contexts, and what the Banshee meant psychologically to people separated from their homeland. First, the mechanics of cultural transmission in immigrant communities. When Irish families arrived in America, they often settled near other Irish immigrants. Neighborhoods became Irish enclaves, where you could speak Irish or Irish-inflected English, attend Catholic churches serving Irish communities, buy from Irish shopkeepers, socialize with Irish neighbors. These ethnic neighborhoods recreated aspects of home in foreign land. And in these spaces, storytelling continued. Wakes, weddings, christenings, pub gatherings, parish events, all provided venues for storytelling. Older immigrants who remembered Ireland directly told stories to younger people born in America. These stories served multiple purposes. They were entertained, obviously, but they also taught children about Ireland, about their heritage, about where their families came from. The Banshee stories were part of this larger cultural education. You learned you were Irish partly by learning Irish stories. The Banshee had special significance in this context because she represented an unbroken connection to Ireland. She followed bloodlines. She didn't recognize geographic boundaries. If you were O'Neill in Ireland, you were O'Neill in Boston, and the Banshee theoretically still cared about your family. This suggested that moving to America didn't sever your essential identity. You remained Irish in ways that transcended physical location. The supernatural realm itself refused to acknowledge the Atlantic Ocean as a meaningful boundary. Reports of banshee-like cries in American immigrant neighborhoods appear in newspapers, letters, and oral histories from the late 1800s and early 1900s. These accounts follow familiar patterns: strange wailing at night, a sound like a woman crying, impossible to locate, fear and recognition among Irish residents. Then, within days or weeks, death in the community. The stories are remarkably similar to Irish accounts, suggesting either genuine phenomenon that followed immigrants or cultural expectations so strong it shaped interpretation of ambiguous sounds. Consider a typical account from Boston in the 1880s. A neighborhood with a heavy Irish population experienced several nights of strange crying sounds. Multiple residents reported hearing it. Some identified it immediately as the Banshee. Others were confused until Irish neighbors explained. Fear spread through the community. People stayed inside after dark. Parents kept their children close. Then an elderly Irish woman, recently arrived from County Cork, died suddenly. The community interpreted this as confirmation. The Banshee had announced her death just as she would have in Ireland. These American encounters had interesting features. The settings were urban rather than rural. Instead of appearing at crossroads or riverbanks, the Banshee supposedly manifested in alleys, near tenements, in industrial areas. She adapted to new geography while maintaining her essential function. Instead of wailing outside cottage windows, she cried in streets lined with row houses. The specific details changed, but the pattern remained. Second-generation Irish Americans, born in America but raised by Irish immigrant parents, occupied interesting middle ground regarding belief. They learned the stories and knew they were supposed to matter, but they were also Americanizing, adopting broader American culture and skepticism. For them, the Banshee often became a marker of their parents' generation, something old-fashioned, something from the old country. They might not genuinely believe, but would still feel cultural obligation to treat the stories respectfully. This brings us to our second section: how the Banshee legend adapted and blended with American contexts. America had its own folklore traditions, including ghost stories and death omens. The Banshee encountered these existing traditions and sometimes blended with them. Regional American folklore included various female spirits and wailing women. The Banshee became one more version of a pattern that existed across cultures. Native American traditions included spirit beings that warned of death or disaster. African American folklore, brought through the horror of slavery, had its own supernatural warnings and omens. The Banshee entered a multicultural supernatural landscape in America, sometimes maintaining her Irish specificity, sometimes bleeding into more general ghost lore. In neighborhoods where Irish, Italian, Polish, and other immigrant communities mixed, supernatural beliefs also mixed, creating hybrid folklores. American Gothic literature and popular culture absorbed the Banshee. She appeared in American horror stories, mystery novels, and eventually films. These treatments often simplified her, removing cultural specificity. She became a generic scary ghost, rather than specifically an Irish supernatural entity with particular rules and patterns. But these appearances kept her name circulating even as they changed her nature. The Banshee also encountered American spiritualism, the 19th century religious movement that believed spirits could communicate with the living through mediums. Some Irish immigrants participated in spiritualist practices, sometimes trying to contact the Banshee or understand her through this framework. This created interesting syncretism, traditional Irish folklore blending with contemporary American spiritual movement. Interestingly, the Banshee sometimes appeared in American contexts, disconnected from Irish families. Non-Irish Americans appropriated the name and concept, claiming to have encountered a Banshee without having Irish ancestry. This bothered some Irish immigrants who felt their cultural property was being misused. The Banshee was supposed to follow Irish bloodline specifically. Having non-Irish people claim encounters felt like cultural theft or misunderstanding. Halloween traditions in America incorporated Irish elements as Irish immigration shaped American culture. The Banshee became associated with Halloween imagery, alongside jack-o'-lanterns and other Irish origin customs. This holiday association further spread awareness of the Banshee, but also further simplified and commercialized her. She became costume decoration, generic spooky symbol, rather than serious cultural belief. Consider this ripple effect. As Irish Americans became more established, more successful, more integrated into broader American society, their relationship with old country folklore changed. The Banshee became heritage rather than active belief. She was something your grandmother believed in, something that connected you to history, but not something you expected to encounter personally. This created interesting generational dynamics where belief faded but cultural attachment persisted. Now let's explore our third section. What the Banshee meant psychologically to immigrants separated from Ireland. Immigration was traumatic. Most Irish immigrants in the 1800s and early 1900s never returned to Ireland. They left knowing they'd probably never see their homeland again, never see family members who stayed behind. This created profound grief and longing that shaped immigrant psychology for generations. The Banshee connected immigrants to what they'd lost, believing that she still followed your family, even in America, meant Ireland itself followed you. Your homeland hadn't forgotten you. The supernatural forces that shaped life in Ireland still knew you existed. This was emotionally powerful. You weren't completely cut off. You weren't completely abandoned. The old country maintained connection through supernatural channels. When Irish immigrants heard strange sounds and interpreted them as the Banshee, they were affirming their Irish identity in foreign land. They were refusing to be completely assimilated. They were insisting that despite living in America, working American jobs, learning American ways, they remained fundamentally Irish at some level deeper than daily life. The Banshee was that deep level made audible. The Banshee also provided a framework for processing death in an immigrant context. When someone died far from Ireland, far from ancestral burial grounds, there could be spiritual anxiety. Were they truly at rest? Did their death count the same way? If the Banshee announced the death, even in America, it suggested continuity. Death in Boston or New York wasn't different from death in Cork or Dublin in the ways that mattered. The supernatural realm recognized all equally. For immigrants who felt guilty about leaving Ireland, about abandoning family, about pursuing better life while others suffered in poverty back home, the Banshee could represent complicated emotions. She was Ireland's voice, and her cry might be interpreted as accusation. You left us. You abandoned your homeland. Now death comes and you're not there to mourn properly. The guilt was real and deep for many immigrants. The Banshee could embody it. Conversely, the Banshee could be comforting. She proved you still mattered. The other world still tracked your family. Your deaths were still important enough to announce. You hadn't fallen so far from grace that even supernatural Ireland forgot you. This validation was psychologically important for people whose identity was under constant pressure to assimilate and forget. Children of immigrants often experience the Banshee as an embarrassment. In American schools, they learned rationality and science. They absorbed American attitudes that treated such beliefs as ignorant superstition. Then they'd go home and hear grandparents talking seriously about the Banshee. This created identity conflict. Are we modern Americans or old-fashioned Irish? The Banshee became a site of generational tension, representing values and worldviews that younger generations sometimes rejected in pursuit of American identity. Yet even as active belief faded, the Banshee retained emotional significance. Third and fourth generation Irish Americans, far removed from Ireland, might not believe in her supernatural reality, but would still feel connected to her as a symbol. She represented heritage, roots, connection to ancestors. People displayed Banshee imagery in their homes, not because they expected her to appear, but because she marked them as Irish descended, as possessing this particular cultural history. The Banshee in America also highlighted how folklore requires community to survive. In dense Irish neighborhoods, where everyone knew the stories and shared the cultural context, Banshee beliefs could persist. But as families moved out to suburbs, as Irish Americans scattered geographically and socially, the community support for belief weakened. Without neighbors who shared the framework, without the social reinforcement of collective storytelling, the Banshee faded from active belief into historical curiosity. Irish American cultural organizations, historical societies, and heritage groups deliberately preserved Banshee lore as part of broader efforts to maintain Irish identity in America. They published folklore collections, sponsored cultural events where stories were shared, created educational materials teaching younger generations about Irish traditions. The Banshee became part of official cultural heritage rather than lived belief, but this preservation work ensured she didn't vanish completely. Let's bring this together. The Banshee crossed the Atlantic with Irish immigrants, adapting to American context while maintaining her core identity. She served crucial psychological functions for people torn between old country and new, helping them maintain Irish identity in foreign land. She evolved from active supernatural belief to cultural symbol across generations, showing how folklore transforms as communities change. And she demonstrated that some stories are too deeply woven into identity to be completely left behind, even when you travel thousands of miles and build new life in new land. But what about today? In our modern, skeptical, globalized world, does the Banshee still matter? Or has she become mere historical curiosity, a quaint legend from a superstitious past? The measure of a story's power isn't just how many people believed it once. It's whether the story continues generating meaning long after literal belief has faded. This isn't about proving the banshee was real or dismissing her as fantasy. It's about understanding why certain symbols persist, what psychological and cultural needs they serve, and how old stories speak to new generations in unexpected ways. Understanding why the banshee still matters means understanding what she represents beyond her role as death's herald. Let's examine her continuing relevance. Walk into any bookstore, browse film streaming services, explore video game catalogs, and you'll find the banshee. She appears constantly in contemporary popular culture, far more than most folklore figures. This persistence isn't random. It reflects something about her that resonates with modern audiences despite living in a world vastly different from the one that created her. She adapted, evolved, and found new relevance in changed contexts. Let's break this into 3 final sections. Her presence in modern popular culture, how scholars and thinkers interpret her symbolically, and what her enduring recognition reveals about mortality, grief, and human needs that don't change even as everything else does. First, the banshee in contemporary popular culture. She appears in films ranging from low-budget horror to major Hollywood productions. Sometimes she's depicted relatively faithfully to traditional Irish lore. More often she's adapted, simplified, made more generically frightening for audiences unfamiliar with Irish folklore. These film banshees scream, kill, terrify in ways traditional legends never described. She became active threat rather than passive warner. This reflects modern horror aesthetics where monsters must be dramatic, violent, visually spectacular. Video games feature banshees prominently. Fantasy role-playing games include them as enemies or allies. Horror games use them for atmosphere. The banshee's distinctive cry translates beautifully to audio design. Game developers use wailing, shrieking sound effects to signal danger, creating visceral player responses. The banshee thus continues her primary function, using sound to communicate threat, even in digital environments. Television shows, both Irish and international, reference the banshee regularly. Irish shows often treat her more respectfully as cultural heritage. British and American shows sometimes use her as shorthand for Irish supernatural elements. Fantasy series incorporate her into broader supernatural worlds. True crime and paranormal investigation shows occasionally cover reported banshee encounters, treating them as mysterious phenomena worth exploring. Literature continues engaging with the banshee. Fantasy novels set in Ireland or featuring Irish characters often include her. Historical fiction, set in periods when banshee belief was strong, uses her to create atmosphere and cultural authenticity. Young adult novels aimed at teenage audiences explore the banshee from new angles, sometimes as protagonist, rather than just frightening force. These literary treatments keep her name circulating, introduce her to new generations, ensure she remains recognizable cultural reference. Comics and graphic novels depict the banshee visually, creating iconic images that shape how people picture her. These visual representations vary wildly, from horrifying monster to beautiful tragic figure. Some stay relatively faithful to traditional descriptions. Others reimagine her completely. but all keep her present in visual culture, maintaining her status as recognizable supernatural entity. Music references the banshee across genres. Rock bands have used the name. Folk musicians perform songs about her. Irish traditional music maintains banshee ballads as part of standard repertoire. Hip-hop artists occasionally reference her. She crosses musical boundaries, showing up wherever artists want to invoke Irish heritage, death symbolism, or feminine supernatural power. Sports teams use banshee-related names and imagery. This is especially common in Ireland itself, but appears elsewhere too. Having a banshee as mascot suggests fierceness, Celtic heritage, intimidation. It says, "We're connected to ancient Irish power. We're fierce and unrelenting. Opposing teams should fear us." This usage continues the banshee's role as identity marker, though now for sports fandom rather than ethnic or national identity. Irish tourist industry uses the banshee strategically. Tour companies offer banshee-themed experiences. Museums include her in folklore exhibitions. Gift shops sell banshee merchandise. She's marketable, recognizable, exotic enough to interest foreign tourists, but accessible enough to not be completely obscure. This commercialization troubles some people who see it as trivializing sacred cultural heritage. Others see it as natural evolution. Folklore adapting to modern economic reality. Academic conferences and scholarly publications still examine the banshee. Folklorists analyze her as example of death omen traditions. Gender studies scholars explore what she reveals about femininity, power, and emotion in Irish culture. Literary scholars trace her appearances across texts. Anthropologists consider her role in community formation and maintenance. She remains subject of serious intellectual inquiry, not dismissed as mere superstition, but treated as complex cultural phenomenon, worth sustained attention. This brings us to our second section, how modern scholars and thinkers interpret the banshee symbolically. She's understood as embodying several universal human concerns that transcend her specific Irish cultural context. First, and most obviously, she represents grief itself. Her wailing is mourning personified. She gives voice to emotions that are difficult to express, pain that seems too large for words. By externalizing grief as a supernatural being, Irish culture created a way to acknowledge and process feelings that might otherwise be overwhelming. Scholars see her as representing the inevitable relationship between life and death. She proves that death watches the living, that mortality is always present even when we try to ignore it. Modern secular culture often treats death as failure, something to be fought and delayed as long as possible. The banshee represents an older world view, where death was accepted as a natural part of the cycle, something to be announced and acknowledged rather than denied. This alternative perspective has value for people struggling with modern death denial. Feminist scholars find the banshee fascinating as an example of female power. She's autonomous, not controlled by male authority. She operates according to her own rules. She commands attention through her voice alone. She represents feminine connection to life cycles, to birth and death, to emotional truth. In cultures that often limited women's power, the banshee was a reminder that certain types of power belonged to women exclusively, that feminine authority couldn't be completely suppressed. Psychologists interpret her as a manifestation of anxiety about death and loss. She embodies the fear that death is coming, but you don't know when or for whom. She represents anticipatory grief. the way we sometimes know at a deep level that loss approaches even when we have no rational reason for that knowledge. She validates intuition and feeling over pure rationality, suggesting that emotional knowledge is real knowledge deserving respect. The Banshee also symbolizes memory and continuity. She represents the past's refusal to stay past, the way history and ancestry continue shaping the present. She's a reminder that we're not separate individuals, but links in chains of family and culture stretching back generations. In an era of geographic mobility and weakened family ties, the Banshee represents rootedness, belonging, connection to something larger than individual life. Environmental thinkers sometimes see her as representing the land itself, Ireland speaking through supernatural voice. She's tied to specific geography, to fairy mounds and rivers and crossroads. She can't be separated from the physical landscape she haunts. This connection between spirit and place suggests that land has memory, that places carry stories, that where you are matters as much as who you are. In a globalized world where everywhere starts looking like everywhere else, this localized specificity feels increasingly precious. Now, our final section. What the Banshee's enduring recognition reveals about mortality, grief, and unchanging human needs. Despite living in scientifically advanced, technologically sophisticated societies, humans still struggle with the same fundamental questions people faced thousands of years ago. Why do we die? How do we handle losing people we love? What happens after death? How do we maintain identity and connection across generations? The Banshee addresses all these questions, which is why she persists. Modern death practices in Western culture are often clinical, sanitized, removed from daily life. People die in hospitals rather than at home. Bodies are handled by professionals rather than family. Grief is expected to be private, contained, quickly resolved. Many people find this unsatisfying. They feel something important is missing from how we handle death. The Banshee represents an alternative approach, one where death is announced publicly, where grief is loud and communal, where the supernatural realm itself validates your loss as important. Contemporary interest in the Banshee sometimes reflects dissatisfaction with modern secularism. When everything is explained scientifically, when mystery is eliminated, when the world is fully mapped and understood, something feels lost. The Banshee represents mystery, the unexplained, the possibility that there's more to reality than material facts. She suggests that rationalism doesn't have all the answers, that older ways of knowing might have captured truths that science misses. The Banshee also addresses the deep human need for warning and preparation regarding death. We want to know it's coming. We want time to say goodbye, to reconcile relationships, to make peace. Modern sudden death, car accidents, heart attacks, offers no such preparation. The Banshee represented a world where death was announced, where you got warning even if you couldn't prevent the loss. This fantasy of preparation remains psychologically appealing. Her connection to specific families speaks to widespread concern about family bonds weakening in modern society. Families scatter geographically. Relatives lose touch. Genealogy becomes unclear. The Banshee represents a world where family identity was absolute, where supernatural forces themselves tracked bloodlines, where you couldn't escape or deny your familial connections. For people feeling unmoored from family, the Banshee symbolizes the rootedness they long for. The Irish diaspora worldwide maintains special connection to the Banshee. For people of Irish descent living far from Ireland, she represents authentic Irish identity. She's a touchstone, a symbol that says you're genuinely connected to Irish heritage. In a world where identity becomes fluid and contested, where authenticity is questioned, having ancestral stories like the Banshee provides grounding. She's a heritage you can claim, regardless of how many generations separate you from Ireland. Young people discovering the Banshee through popular culture often find unexpected depth. They encounter her in a video game or film, think she's just a scary monster, then research her and discover the rich folklore tradition. This discovery can spark genuine interest in Irish culture, in folklore studies, in how stories work and what they mean. The Banshee becomes a gateway to deeper understanding of how humans create and use stories to make sense of life's hardest questions. The Banshee also matters as a reminder of what we've lost in modernization. Oral tradition, communal storytelling, shared belief systems, tight-knit communities where everyone knew everyone. All of this has largely vanished. The Banshee represents that lost world. She reminds us that humans once lived differently, understood reality differently, processed emotions differently. Whether that older way was better is debatable, but knowing it existed expands our sense of human possibility. Let's bring everything together for a final landing. The Banshee endures because she addresses fundamental human experiences that don't change despite all surface changes. She represents grief, mortality, family, identity, mystery, the relationship between past and present. She survived transition from oral to written culture, from belief to symbol, from local legend to global icon, because she's flexible enough to carry new meanings while maintaining her essential character. She matters today not because people necessarily believe in her supernatural reality, but because she represents something true about the human experience of loss and the human need for rituals that acknowledge our deepest emotions. The Banshee is not gone. Her cry still echoes through Ireland's memory and through the memories of Irish descendants worldwide. She appears in our stories, our entertainment, our art. She reminds us that death deserves acknowledgement, that grief deserves expression, that the past shapes the present in ways we don't fully control. She proves that some stories are too powerful, too necessary, too deeply human to ever completely fade. Ireland's harbinger of death remains Ireland's gift to understanding mortality itself, a voice from the ancient world that still has something vital to tell us about being human in any era.